Good morning. We're about to get started, and if we could have everybody please take their seats. So good morning and welcome to the FCC's Learn Everything About Reverse Auction Now, or LEARN program, to discuss unlicensed spectrum issues related to the broadcast television incentive auction. This morning's workshop will focus on the benefits and uses of unlicensed spectrum in the existing and future television bands, white spaces, and in the guard bands of the new 600 megahertz band following the upcoming incentive auction, as well as technical questions associated with the proposed unlicensed operations. To kick off today's workshop, we're going to do it with a bang. We're going to have introductory remarks from our new chairman, Tom Wheeler, who's participating in his very first FCC workshop as chair of the FCC. And just like the Beatles concerts, you can all say, you were there. I wanted to congratulate Chairman Tom Wheeler, not on the chairmanship, but that he's survived his first week. And survived is not the right word because he's really hit the ball out of the park. So it's my great privilege and honor to introduce the chairman of the FCC, Tom Wheeler.
Thank you, Julie. So let's see, the Beatles, Let It Be, is that how we should be doing this? Not only is it my first meeting like this, but this is the first time I've ever been on this side of the dais. It's kind of nice up here. Thank you all for participating. And Julie Knapp, what a national treasure Julie is. You know, I mean... So I'm going to let you in on a little secret that heretofore has just been between Julie and me, but everybody deserves to know, and that is that early on in this process, while I was waiting to be confirmed and thinking about how we would get things done here at the commission, I realized that Julie was a national asset and that I'd better call Julie and make sure he was sticking around. And so it's a true story, right? So I called Julie and I said, you are going to stick around, right? And he assured me that he was, and that makes the whole process much more achievable. And so bless you, Julie. And Gary Epstein isn't here. You'll see Gary. He's not here right now, but you'll see Gary in the process as well. He has the unenviable task of leading the auction task force, and just how in the world do we pull off an incentive auction, a two-sided auction with real-time rebanding in the process, something that has never been tried in the history of the world, but we're going to pull it off. And I'm extremely mindful of the fact that the leadership of Chairman Janikowski, the leadership of Chairwoman Clyburn, the work of the members of the task force and the staff of the FCC that have brought us to this point. The conduct of a successful auction is a top priority. And let me underline the term successful auction. We have been running it, and I can assure you we will continue to run it in an open and transparent process, of which this is a key component. It's interesting. So they gave me some talking points that I wanted to make sure I covered today, and one of them was to make a reference to this blog that I did earlier in the week when, and it's always fascinating to see what people draw out of what you had said previously, and so the text that was written here says, I wrote 2 things worth repeating. Now that always makes you feel real good, okay? That the people who are writing your stuff think you said something worth repeating, and that's okay, and they want you to repeat it. But I do believe, I hope there were more than 2, but I do believe in a couple of things. One, the reason we run an open and transparent process is that there is no such thing as a good surprise. It's the golden rule. And the second, and I think the one that resonates the most, or I hope resonates the most, is that not all wisdom resides on the 8th floor, and I can guarantee you it doesn't reside in the corner office of the chairman. And that's why what you're doing here is so vital and so important. So let me talk a little bit about unlicensed. I've had a little experience with spectrum auctions over the years from a different vantage point. But I know how claims are made and counterclaims are made, and if you don't do it my way, it's the end of civilization as we know it, and that if you're for this industry or you're against this industry, and how everything gets posited. And I want to be really clear that what we are is we're pro-America. We're pro how do you use spectrum most efficiently for the common good of this nation to drive economic growth and to make sure that we maintain world leadership in the application of spectrum-delivered services. There are going to be tensions between broadcast and mobile. There are going to be tensions between mobile and between licensed and unlicensed. And our job, consistent with the Spectrum Act, is to continue America's leadership in the spectrum world. And it's a process full of give and take. It's a process full of challenges, but it's also a process that is not as extreme in consequences one way or another as sometimes the my way or the end of the world presentations are. But let me be clear about one thing, and that is that unlicensed spectrum has been and must continue to be the catalyst for innovation. And therefore we must make sure that unlicensed spectrum is a key part of whatever set of decisions that we make. I remember when the discussions of unlicensed spectrum were all about garage door openers. I remember a telephone call that I got at one point in time saying that they were going to name a new unlicensed capability after a Nordic king by the name of Bluetooth. And I've seen how far we've come with unlicensed RFID, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc., etc. We're not going to stop that path. Unlicensed has been not only a key to innovation, not only a key to making wireless something manifest to consumers in their daily lives in a very easy way through Wi-Fi, for instance, or through your Bluetooth headset, or whatever the case may be. But it's also been a great enabler of the licensed services and the ability to offload services from the licensed. So I have no doubt that the things that are going to come from future unlicensed services are as unimaginable as something being named for a Nordic king named Bluetooth. And we are going to make sure that the opportunity exists in how we make our spectrum decisions to see that that pathway exists to build that future. You're going to deal with some tough issues today. You're going to help us work our way through this process. And we're really grateful to you for the investment of time and effort that you have put into this. And I look forward to learning about the results of this workshop. So thank you all for coming. We look forward to the results, and I turn it back over to your host, Mr. Knapp.
Well, one thing hasn't changed. I still have a tough act to follow. I would be remiss as I thought about the workshop in not mentioning someone probably only a few of you knew. His name was Herman Garland. Herman Garland actually, when I first came to work at the FCC, he was my first boss. And he really invented the unlicensed rules. When the Act was first written, it included a provision that said everything has to be licensed. And one of the first products at the time that they encountered was something called a phono-oscillator. It was a device to transmit from a phonograph. I think some of you may have read about those in history. And a radio, an AM radio. And everybody knew that it didn't make any sense to license these things individually. So they scratched their head, and believe it or not, it took a few years, and they came up with this idea that, well, these are operating in what the engineers called the near field. And the near field is the magnetic field, and the magnetic field isn't radio. So therefore, we didn't have to license them. and out of that seed grew all of these wondrous products that Chairman Wheeler had mentioned. And so what we're going to be talking about today is how we maintain that legacy of innovation and services that have been introduced under the unlicensed rules. I thought I'd take just a few minutes to set the stage for the discussions we're going to have today. And I know many of you in the room are familiar with this, but I thought it'd be good for everybody to have the same understanding. So the FCC in 2010 had finalized rules to allow for operation of low-power devices in the so-called white spaces. These are the parts of the spectrum that may not be used at any given location for TV broadcasting, which is not to say that there weren't other uses in those spaces, but in most locations there were parts of the spectrum that weren't actually being used. So the rules were based on a very novel approach where the devices have to access a database of protected services. In the database were all the services of TV broadcasting, translators, cable head ends, and so forth. And so the devices would list where they're located, and they'd get back a list of the spectrum that was available at that spot. The devices were not permitted to operate on Channel 37. Channel 37 is actually not used for TV broadcasting. It's allocated for radio astronomy, and it's also allocated and used for wireless medical telemetry. And believe it or not, even the wireless medical telemetry had grown out of the unlicensed space. Medical telemetry had been operating on Channel 7 through 13. They didn't use database technology, and when the first HDTV stations went on the air, suddenly we had a collision, and that's why we moved them into Channel 37. There were also provisions for coexistence with wireless microphones, and they had two features. First of all, there were two channels that were left available at any given location where the whitespace devices would not operate, generally on either side of Channel 37. And in addition to that, we provided for registration of wireless microphones for, not the exact term that's in the rules, but for major events, things like sporting events, theaters, where they use many more wireless microphones than can be accommodated in just two channels. So since then, we've approved the first devices. We approved the databases for Spectrum Bridge, Telcordia, which is now iConnective, and Google. And we have databases from LS Telecom, Keybridge, and ComCert's also moving through the process. So there's been a lot of interest in this, and not to get off on a tangent, but we've also looked to build upon that idea consistent with recommendations from the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology with a proposal that we have outstanding at 3.5 gigahertz for a licensed service that has many features of the database, but more sophisticated than what we had in the TV white spaces. So the FCC issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on the broadcast television incentive auction in, it was late September of 2012. And relative to unlicensed, the NPRM sought to provide substantial spectrum for unlicensed on a nationwide basis. So under the rules that we had in place, there are spots where there may be little or no spectrum for unlicensed because for example, in downtown New York, there's so many operations, there really isn't much white space to speak of. Plus, you've got, if you look at the theater district, when the theaters light up, there really isn't much space, if any, left. So what we tried to do in the proposal is provide spectrum nationwide that would assure that wherever you are, the devices could operate. We would have continued to allow the unlicensed operation on unused channels in the repack television broadcast bands. And then we issued some proposals that we've received pretty extensive comment upon, and I'm sure are going to be discussed today. And these include things consistent with the legislation, which discussed permitting unlicensed use in guard bands. We talked about guard bands in the proposal of 6 megahertz. There's been a lot of discussion on the size of those and where they should be. We also invited comment on allowing unlicensed use in Channel 37 with exclusion zones to protect radio astronomy and wireless medical telemetry. And then we also asked about whether we should permit operation in what had previously been the reserved channels. So our first panel this morning is going to discuss the benefits and uses of unlicensed. You're going to hear from people who have been working on deployment of devices and services. It may seem like a long time since the rules were adopted, but actually in the overall scheme of things, I try to remind people it takes time to develop products and services and deploy them. Nothing happens overnight. So we're going to hear about that in the first panel. And then the second panel, we're going to be focusing a bit more on the technical questions associated with the proposal. So with that, I'd like to introduce Alan Stillwell and Jerry Matisse from the Office of Engineering Technology and invite the panelists to come up, and we'll get started. Sure.
Take it, or one alphabet.
Oh, there's Harold.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone.
My name's Alan Stillwell, as Julie indicated, and this is Jerry Matisse. We're co-moderators of Panel 1 here. And on this panel, we're going to talk about the benefits and uses of white space devices in the TV bands. Not just white space, but unlicensed devices in the TV bands. And we're going to look at the spectrum that's going to be used for white space after the spectrum auction in the bands remaining for use by television, and also the guard band and duplex gap spectrum and frequencies that'll be in the spectrum that's recovered after the auction. And I just want to begin the panel here with a little bit of additional background information, and Julie provided some on this. But of course, as Julie indicated, unlicensed devices are just an increasingly important part of our everyday life, and they're growing. I mean, I think the two things you can say about unlicensed devices for sure is that they've grown tremendously and they're still growing. So, and this growth is really attributed to the success of Wi-Fi and also to some extent Bluetooth. And, we often think of Wi-Fi as just this link that provides us internet connectivity around our homes and offices, but it's really a lot more than that. For example, many cameras now have a Wi-Fi capability that you can use to download pictures to your computer. So it's a lot more than internet. There's no internet involved there. It's just camera to computer, device to device. So there's going to be a lot more of these kinds of applications developing. And with all these applications, there's just more need for spectrum for unlicensed devices. And we here at the Commission have been working very hard over the last few years to find places for white spaces to operate. And one of these is the UHF and VHF spectrum in the TV bands. As Julie indicated, at many locations there are channels that aren't used for various reasons. And if you plot the service areas of all the licensed transmitters in the TV bands on a map and color them in, the spectrum or the geographic areas that remain are white. So, a few years ago, we observed that this white space spectrum, that's why we call it that, could be used for unlicensed devices without causing harmful interference to any licensed services. And that that this spectrum could actually facilitate a lot of new applications and uses. And this is because the UHF and VHF spectrum have different propagation characteristics in the higher bands. These differences mainly have to do with longer range and better building penetration. So then a couple years ago, we adopted rules to allow operation in the unlicensed bands. And to operate, the unlicensed device first contacts one of the white space databases Julie talked about, and then gives the database its geographic coordinates. Then the database returns a list of channels that are available for operation at that location, and the white space device is only allowed to operate on those channels. So this is how we prevent interference with the licensed services. And the trick of the databases is that they have to be able to determine what channels are available at any given geographic area, and even within a major market or a sub-market, channels vary from place to place. I mean, here at the FCC, we have one list of channels. Over at the Capitol, there's a different list of channels. So, So we now have a number of devices that we've approved. A white space is beginning to move forward. And there are also a number of organizations that are working on projects to exploit unlicensed resources. And then after the auction, as I said, we're going to have unused spectrum in the duplex gap between the wireless bands, and also in the guard bands that'll be between TV services and the wireless services. So, and we anticipate making those bands also available for unlicensed use. So we're looking really for a great future with new white space devices, or I should say new unlicensed devices in this the TV spectrum. And to kick off our discussion about that, Jerry is going to introduce our panelists, and then I'll talk with our first part of our panel. I want to say a few administrative things before we actually get going. One is that, if I can find the right piece of paper here. Yeah, okay. This workshop is being broadcast live on the Internet, and you can access that, and that's the thing I'm looking here for. Here it is. It's www.fcc.gov/live. So you can review it right now on the Internet that way. And after the workshop, you can also see a replay, or you can view it on www.fcc.gov/events, and then look for this particular workshop. At the end of our main panel discussion, if there's time, we'll accept questions from the audience. I think Cecilia might have note cards that she'll pass around. Yeah, okay. What's your name, ma'am? Kayla will have note cards and pass it around. And we'll also take live questions from people on the Internet, and the email address for that is livequestions, one word, livequestions, at fcc.gov, okay, for those participating online. So now we're going to begin our panel. That's right. I'm sorry, Jerry's doing an introduction. I get a little ahead of myself. Excuse me.
Okay. I'd like to introduce our panelists today, starting here with Dr. Andrew Afflerbach. He's Director of Engineering for CTC Engineering and Technology. He specializes in system-level planning, design, and implementation of wide area and local area telecommunication networks. He's currently developing the design for a TV white space broadband network for underserved and unserved areas in Garrett County, Maryland. Next to him is Elizabeth Bowles. She's president and chairman of the board of Aristotle, Inc. She's the immediate past president of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, or WISPA, which is a trade association that represents the fixed wireless industry, and she's currently the WISPA legislative chair. Next to her is Jim Carlson, who's president, chief executive officer, and chief technical officer for Carlson Wireless, which develops, builds, and markets fixed wireless telecommunications systems. Carlson Wireless is focused on demonstrating dynamic spectrum sharing technologies with vacant TV frequencies. Next, we have Harold Felt, who's senior vice president for public knowledge and advocates for the public interest in media, telecommunications, and technology policy. Paul Garnett is director of Microsoft's Technology Policy Group, where he focuses on promoting affordable broadband access. Paul and his team work with governments, research institutions, companies, and NGOs around the world to foster new wireless technologies and business models that will reduce the cost of wireless bandwidth and enable billions of people to get online more easily. Next is Joanne Hovis. She's president of CTC, which is a boutique telecommunications consulting firm that supports public sector clients in the areas of business consulting, strategic planning, and market assessment. Joanne also serves on the advisory group of the Gigabit Libraries Network, which is a pilot program to extend access to library Wi-Fi over a wide area using TV whitespace spectrum. Next is Robert Rucker, who's Vice President of Operations and Technology for United Negro College Fund, where he is responsible for overseeing governance of internal audit, compliance, and technology. UNCF is one of the higher education partners in AIR-U, which is a consortium working to expand broadband access to underserved higher education campuses and their communities using TV whitespace spectrum. Next is Peter Stanforth, who's CTO and co-founder of Spectrum Bridge. Spectrum Bridge developed the first TV whitespace database that the FCC approved and was deployed in Wilmington, North Carolina in January 2012. And last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, who's Vice President and Chief Research and Policy Officer for the Minority Media and Telecommunications Council, MMTC, which is a national not-for-profit organization that is dedicated to promoting and preserving equal opportunity, minority ownership, and civil rights in the mass media, telecommunications, and broadband industries. She's also a member of the FCC's Federal Advisory Committee on Diversity in the Digital Age, where she chairs the subcommittee on the use of unlicensed devices to increase minority innovation and entrepreneurship. And Alan and I welcome all of you here and thank you for participating. Alan?
Good. So now we're going to kind of get into the meat of our discussion here, and we're going to begin with a section where we're going to talk about what the capabilities of unlicensed devices are in the TV bands. So I think we'll probably address a lot of this to Peter, Jim, and Paul, but other folks on the panel are also welcome and encouraged to participate. The questions we want to look into here are the types of equipment that are currently available, what types of applications could be deployed, for example, in broadband video, machine-to-machine, whatever, and how much spectrum is available and needed for different types of applications. So maybe, Jim, if you could kind of begin, kind of give us a picture of what kinds of equipment are available and what technical applications are being deployed, and maybe Peter, Paul, you could pitch in there too.
Sure, thank you, Alan. What we've seen evolve in the last 3-4 years or so is people specializing in looking at the markets of machine-to-machine, whether this is the agriculture business or if it's the narrowband telemetry type communications, maybe oil and gas or so forth. We've seen products that evolve kind of specializing for that, and we've seen products evolving for this specializing in rural broadband type or community wireless, muni wireless, where you're looking for coverage as your major commodity rather necessarily than range. Has been proven in some of the tests that Microsoft had done early on, the coverage capabilities of using the UHF and VHF frequency bands were approximately 3 to 5 times greater than the microwave bands that had been used in the past. And so we have this big advantage, what I'd call a high quality spectrum availability in the sub-gigahertz areas. So sort of stepping into products, as Alan had mentioned, there's a couple manufacturers kind of focused on top performance and coverage, us being, involved with that, and Adaptrum, another one. And there's a couple companies focused on the maybe oil and gas telemetry and performance for range, but not the demanding bandwidth. And we've got KTS and a few others there too. So.
Okay, good.
Microsoft is involved in a lot of different projects around the world on this. I have kind of I would say, a unique job in that I get to go around the world and talk to network operator partners and set up pilot projects in all kinds of locations. And
pretty awesome and exciting. Yeah,
it's great. And we've done projects now on 4 continents. We have projects live right now in Africa and Asia. 3 projects in Africa right now: Tanzania, Kenya, South Africa. And actually, as Mr. Rucker, as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, we ought to. I'm actually I have a project right now with a historically black college in South Africa called University of Limpopo, and I'm wondering if there's a way for us to do a little tie-up with one of the projects that's going on here in the U.S. But
good.
And so and the projects, so 3 in Africa, 2 in Asia right now, 1 in Singapore and the other in the Philippines. Always in partnership with a network operator and with government and with various other innovators in market. Mm-hmm. And we've done projects that really run the gamut in terms of applications and services delivered. Anything from sort of the obvious, which is rural broadband access. We're doing that in Kenya and South Africa. And in Kenya, what we're seeing using different white space radios, and there are more and more products coming on market all the time. But what we're seeing is quite encouraging in terms of the throughput and range and latency capabilities of these radios. And you can deploy networks using white space radios today, with basically Wi-Fi hanging off the end, and enable consumers to gain access to the internet who've never had it before. And one of the other benefits is the power trade-offs you can gain through using the spectrum. So in Kenya, we're doing an entirely solar-powered network because, after all, 80% of Kenyans don't have power where they live. So you can't deliver broadband access without also solving that problem. In Tanzania, it's urban. It's university campuses, and we're working with a partner there to deploy some networks in downtown Dar es Salaam, and that's going to present its own host of challenges. The spectral environment in an urban market in Africa is not the same as it is in the U.S., and there's going to be some interesting things we're going to learn from that. In Singapore, you're talking about probably one of the most connected places on the planet, and one would wonder, well, if they have all this connectivity, why would they want white spaces? I mean, after all, they have gigabit connectivity to the home and the like, and nonetheless, they still want more ubiquitous, more available, and cheaper bandwidth. And there, we're focused on a whole bunch of smart city type applications, as well as broadband connectivity. That project involves 18 companies, most of which are Singaporean, including companies from Singapore who are now manufacturing radios. So I think from an applications perspective, from a device perspective, I mean, the chairman said it earlier, as did Julie. Really the sky's the limit. I think we should just, I think we should expect the unexpected from this, just like we have experienced with the other unlicensed bands and other unlicensed technologies.
Yeah, what kind of speeds are you seeing on these different links that you've been working with?
So and of course that always depends in terms of the service you're trying to deliver and how you're dividing it out. But if you just look at what you're getting from a channel, in Kenya we have the network set up there in a very rural area. We're getting basically 10-kilometer range off the TV white space base station's operating at 4 watts EIRP. Small base station, cheap, $30,000 total to basically the full bill of materials for the base station, solar powered. And at the end of those connections, basically 10 kilometers away at schools that we're now serving, we're getting 16 megabits per second.
So that's great.
And also with low latency. So someone can be at that school and do Skype video, no problem. We've done it. We've shown this in different events. In fact, if someone from the FCC OET wants to get on a Skype call with someone in Kenya sometime on white spaces, I'm happy to arrange that.
Cool. Peter, earlier you had some nifty little gadgets there. I think you got some things to offer here on this one too.
Sure. So, just echoing what Paul said, what we do today is, I think, just scratching the tip of the iceberg, as it were, or surface. And while there's a lot of focus on last mile broadband, and I think it's very elegant and appropriate, I want to talk about a couple of different applications that have sort of got a lot of traction since the rules became real here. The first is in the ag business. The agriculture business is obviously generally in farms and fields, and a lot of times when they're in farms and fields, there's no cellular coverage because generally there aren't many cows that have cell phones. And then the other problem is that they live in environments where obviously they're talking about growing crops or harvesting, orange groves or whatever. And so the microwave solutions don't tend to work too well. It's the issue that Jim brought up about the range. And so white space is very well suited to serving agriculture. And so far we've seen two very specific, very useful and economically viable applications. The first is really what I call sort of monitoring and control. So this is soil sensors in the field. Sometimes it's tracking animals, or it's actually controlling those big pivots, the big watering wheels that go around, in quarter-mile circles. And the economics are very compelling. The cost of linking a pivot to a central control and management system can be offset if they either save or water 1 or 2 days more or less in a given year. So they can get their payback very quickly on those. The other is a more sort of automated farming application where now you're finding that the vehicles around the farm are driving themselves, and they sort of go out in pods, and there's a harvester and a loader and all sorts of things, and they actually chatter to each other as they roam around in the field next to each other using short-range technologies like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. But somewhere a mile or two away, the farmer wants to know where these vehicles are and what they're doing for safety and management. And so what they do is they use white space as an umbilical because it can go through the trees and over the hill. And when you look again at the cost of the equipment, tractors these days, $200,000 or $300,000, harvesters $700,000, a few $1,000s for a white space link is something they can get back. And it's all about the fact that these things will then run 24/7. And so the planting season is elongated because you can do it all day and all night, and the harvesting season is elongated, so you get more crops in the ground and more crops out of the ground. So for a lot of different reasons, they become economically very viable. The other one, which is the little gizmos I've got, is these are actually white space devices. I actually bought these off of Amazon for about $20 a piece. But that's a slightly different application. One of the radios that's been certified is a very low power transmitter broadcaster that's designed for digital content distribution. And in its initial thought, it was for putting into big box stores, so you could put a TV at the end cap of an aisle or next to a checkout, and from some location in the back, you could be putting content, advertising, or whatever. But when you start to look at this, which nicely goes into translate my iPad, sorry, Paul, I don't have a Surface, into a white space device, I can now stream content to this. And it could be live video, but because it's using digital transmission capabilities, it's IP, it could also be a textbook to a kid or to a training manual to a policeman or a fireman. And so that opens up all sorts of possibilities. So this is my iPad version, and actually this is the one that goes on the Surface. I just don't have one to put it in. But they're very simple and cheap. The reason they're so cheap is they're using existing technology. So these are reusing technology that existed in a new unlicensed way. And in these cases, they're simply receivers, because it is a broadcast or one-way solution, but it opens up all sorts of interesting new applications, distributing content to all the people in a stadium watching a game, when they plug something into their
I could see this in schools, college classrooms,
Yep.
where you get the notes from the professor or the instructor at the beginning of the lecture, and instead of writing furiously down, you can pay attention to what they say. And
so I mean, it comes back to something again that Chairman Wheeler said, is that cellular type technology is licensed and very efficient at certain things, but in some cases broadcast is by far the most efficient way of delivering something to people, and this is what this application does. And then others, the unlicensed, in the agriculture world. So I think we've got to find ways for them all to coexist and use whichever one's the best, most appropriate for what we're doing.
Yeah, I just like to deal one last little point in this area is that how do you all see kind of the white space, eco space developing? How do we go forward? Where do we go forward? Is it going to go forward around the world, here in the U.S.? Just kind of like this, like prognostication, where you kind of put your futurist hat on, and I've heard a lot of really interesting applications here. Some I really wasn't aware of myself, and this is really kind of exciting stuff.
The ecosystem is developing. There are companies out there who already have radios, and there's plenty of evidence of that here. And in terms of the broader ecosystem, there's obviously some great progress that's been made around standards, and for example on Wi-Fi and machine-to-machine standardization. But to be quite honest with you, it's been a bit of a kind of fits and starts kind of issue, and part of the issue really is around regulatory certainty, which is sort of apropos to this event. The fact is that there are big companies who are sitting on the sidelines today because they don't really see the regulatory certainty that they need in order to move forward with investment. There are some companies that are doing it, and they're willing to take the additional risk involved, but there are many more who frankly have slowed it down because of what's happening here in D.C. and with other regulators around the world.
Well, I'm hoping that we can get that kind of stuff straightened out soon here. I think all of us here at the FCC understand some of that, and we want to get that worked out so we can move forward.
Are there other factors that are significant for driving the ecosystem, either positively or negatively?
In my view, it really is going to happen if the regulation, the picture around regulation becomes clearer, and that there's a sufficient, we talked about this earlier, that there's a sufficient amount of spectrum below 700 megahertz that is unlicensed, and it's on a nationwide basis.
What's a sufficient amount of spectrum, Paul?
Yeah.
I mean, it's always more is better, obviously, and you're at the other end of that all the time, and everyone's always coming in and asking you for as much as they can get. The Wi-Fi Alliance has taken the position that out of this process and within the framework that's been given to you by Congress, there should be at least the equivalent of 4 TV channels available in every market in the U.S. Plus TV white space where that might exist below 600 megahertz or below where the spectrum has been reallocated and assigned. That seems like a reasonable approach to us.
For some of these applications, does the spectrum have to be contiguous, or is there research going on to use non-contiguous spectrum blocks?
I think that the contiguous or not issue is pretty close to over. The product design has evolved to the point where it does not need to be contiguous anymore to be able to aggregate bandwidth.
That said, there are efforts that have been done around bonding non-contiguous channels, and that's an option that is going to be available, for example, under the 802.11 AF Wi-Fi standard. But at the same time, you can do a lot with one channel as well, and we're seeing that already. It really depends on the application. If you're talking about moving a lot of data, for example, within building, if you're trying to get beyond a couple walls and moving that data, if you can start to channel bond, you can do a lot more with that, obviously.
Well, one more thing. Is the technology that's being used here in the U.S. Similar to what's being used in other countries, Paul? I mean, is this a global product market that's going to be developing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. That's the goal, and that's why we're engaged with governments around the world.
I see Peter and Jim both have.
Well, the radios that we support here in the U.S. and that the same radios are fundamentally the same around the world. The TV band is relatively harmonized. The biggest difference is that some countries use 6 megahertz channels and some use 8. But to a radio guy like Jim, that's a very trivial thing to solve, as long as you're in the same band. And so the proposed regulation is similar. Mm-hmm. So most of the radio vendors we work with here in the U.S. are the same folks we work with in the U.K. and Singapore and all the places. Same thing for Paul as well. We work with the same folks, and their expectation is that this will be a global market, not just a U.S. market.
So this is really an international community and an international effort that's developing here. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say earlier, Chairman Wheeler called Julie Knapp a national treasure. I actually think he's an international treasure because I'm constantly trying to get him to, and he experienced the pain of international travel coming back from Singapore a few months back, but. This is a great story for America, and as unlicensed has been, and the policy making and technical innovation that's happened in the U.S. around TV white spaces is something that is being looked at around the world, and it's a model that we can replicate around the world. So we got to get it right.
Yeah. Jim, did you have something to add?
No, I think that Paul and Peter did good with that.
Some of the points you've all touched on really flow very much into some of the applications and projects that are going on right now here in the U.S., especially for broadband access. And some of our panelists, I think, can speak quite well to 3 in particular, the Gigabit Library Project and AirU and the Garrett County. Because these represent essentially public access, educational access, and rural access. And certainly when we're talking about TV white spaces, we've all made the point, it depends on exactly where you are in terms of how much spectrum in the broadcast bands you're going to have. But we know that in some areas, yes, it's very limited. In other areas, it's quite abundant. And I think I'd like to start with Joanne in terms of the gigabit libraries. If you could explain to us what Gigabit Library Network is all about and why it's so important.
Thank you. The initiative is an effort of.
You can pull that in if you're. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. It's an effort of a number of parties in partnership with many of the manufacturers and with libraries throughout the country. And the idea here is that one of the extraordinary successes of Wi-Fi has been free public Wi-Fi at public libraries throughout the country. It's been an incredibly important way in which libraries and the communities they represent have managed to get internet access to people who either can't access it at home or can't afford to access it at home. And we all know the extensive stories of families during the hard times of the past few years parking outside libraries at night so children can do homework and so on. It's been a major area of growth in services for libraries and a very important part of community access to broadband. And the idea behind using this new technology is to expand that library access. So it's currently estimated that about 80 million people access the internet at their libraries, and of that, probably half are using a wireless mechanism, using Wi-Fi to connect to the internet. That is, however, still just a fraction of the number of libraries there are throughout the country, particularly in rural areas where bandwidth is very difficult to come by or very costly. And the idea here is that central library facilities will be able to share their bandwidth to remote facilities, including mobile facilities such as book vans, for example, to enable new access to Wi-Fi at those locations. So the new white space technology, which is even now relatively affordable and low barrier given that it's unlicensed, will enable the sharing of bandwidth from one facility to another, and then Wi-Fi at that facility, including mobile facilities, will distribute that signal to users who need public access at their libraries. That's the central thought. The idea is in pilot stage. The Gigabit Libraries Network has gone through essentially an RFP process inviting libraries to apply, and they are then able to trial equipment with some technical support and help to see how the technology is working, and the first indications are outstanding. There is a lot of interest and strong preliminary success, with a hope that we move on to second stage pilots in the next year.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I read that there were actually 50 library systems that applied for the initial pilot, and 6 have been chosen, and they're distributed around the country in 6 different states: Colorado, Mississippi, Illinois, California, Kansas, and New Hampshire.
So how are you providing the service? Are you providing it directly from a white space device to a consumer device, or are you going from white space device to a Wi-Fi device and then distributed that way, or do you have a mix?
White space to Wi-Fi.
White space to Wi-Fi. Okay, so you kind of provide service to kind of a hub and then go that way. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, and of course, some of the earlier, the other commenters have made this point too. I think Paul mentioned it's the Wi-Fi hanging off the end. Of course, the benefit of that is everybody's got Wi-Fi. If you've got a smartphone, you've got Wi-Fi. If you've got a laptop or a tablet, you've got Wi-Fi. So there isn't a need to buy any new or special equipment. The white space spectrum is being used to connect to basically bridge the internet drop to the library, the main library, broadcast it out to the branches, who then convert it to a Wi-Fi signal, and users access it that way.
Exactly, and those branches may not have more than a T1, and in some cases they may not even have a T1 because it may not be affordable for it. Right. Small rural libraries are as under-resourced as any institution we're ever going to see, and this is a means of getting them bandwidth that most of their users will have some way of accessing.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I think a similar construction, Robert, is being used for AirU, right? And again, the importance of trying to reach higher education facilities in particular, many of which are located in small towns, in rural areas or mountainous areas all around the country.
Absolutely. We are focusing on the so what factor. So all that we've heard, there is a so what factor. What does that mean? What's the outcome? Underserved communities historically have not had the same resources and access as the greater population. What UNCF-ARU are focused on is looking at this opportunity to provide services through those institutions in those communities to serve the broader good of the communities that they represent. Oftentimes, the schools in these smaller, underserved communities have a greater role other than just the educational factor. They provide health services, voter registration. They're oftentimes the primary employer. There is a larger role that they play, and being able to use that hub as an opportunity, if you will, to not only enhance the capability of the schools to be sustainable and produce the products that they produce, which are next generation leaders, but also to impact then the surrounding communities. That has a cascading economic impact. We've had a successful launch in Morgantown at the University of West Virginia, and we are looking at other opportunities in South Carolina. But so what? The so what factor is an endless opportunity, if you will, to fill a gap, to connect part of the society that heretofore has been disconnected, and that intellectual capital has not been tapped. So this is an opportunity to bring those communities into the 21st century, if you will, in a way that's affordable and sustainable. The pilot at West Virginia has had a very good feedback and success, and we're looking to be able to leverage that type of capability throughout these communities and bring them into the broader fabric, if you will, for the contributions that they're able to make, given the opportunity to have access.
I'd like to get Dr. Afflerbach to talk about the Garrett County project, which is geared towards rural areas. Your company was very involved in doing a sort of a mapping of Garrett County, that western Maryland area. It's a very interesting report that's available online. And there is definitely broadband service throughout the state of Maryland, but what happened to southern Garrett County?
It's an area that has a lot of great things going for it, but one of the things that we found upon trying to address the issue that you mentioned, Jerry, the lack of service there, is that there isn't a huge business case among the current carriers who are serving much of the county very well and are being very cooperative for the most part, but in this area in the southern portion and then pockets throughout, there isn't a business case to build out through the infrastructure that they have. So we're looking at the white spaces technology to starting off to do a pilot implementation and find strategies to serve the 3,000 or so that were identified in that report as not being served. There's scattered DSL and mobile in some of those areas. For the most part, these are low-income, wooded, mountainous type area. This is driven by economic development. The Garrett County Department of Economic Development is funding a pilot with matching funds from the Appalachian Regional Council to serve 200 homes and businesses in these areas. Broadband is the number one goal right now of Garrett County Economic Development, and this particular pilot goal is to help incubate home-based businesses. So we have those would be things like crafts, agriculture, very light industry. So the county's capital investment will turn around the economic equation so that operationally this will be a self-sustaining venture. Again, this is something that would not be possible at all without the white spaces spectrum. We've examined full range of the existing wireless technologies, the 3.6 gig, the 2.4 gig license. What you find is that this is a way to pull this off with 3 base station locations, one of which incidentally is going to be located on a ridge top alongside wind turbines on a meteorological tower, so you have the intersection of a lot of the sort of the new up-and-coming technologies in the county all in one space. And the specification is that to support the use that we're seeing here, we want to have a delivery mechanism that would have no data caps, that would provide services in the few megabits per second range. And as Paul mentioned, the low latency is important as well, because of interactive video and the ability for these individuals who are running the businesses to connect pretty much anywhere in the world, as well as the individuals who live there to be able to get the resources that they need from school, the online textbooks, and all the other things that are taken for granted in the more built-up areas in the rest of Maryland would be available to these individuals also in Garrett County.
Yeah, I know the population isn't too dense there, and that's part of the reason why you need this. But about how many people are you serving, let's say, from a given link?
Well, this is a last mile white spaces implementation. Unfortunately, the density is exactly enough so that you can't use Wi-Fi to distribute beyond an individual home or business for the most part. So what's happening is that you're delivering to a white spaces end device, and then to the extent that there's Wi-Fi or anything like that there, it's just within the individual home or business.
I see. So that kind of makes sense. So in other words, it could be like a 3 or 4 homes or something in a little area, or just a single home at a location. I mean, I've been out to that area. It's lovely country, but there's not too many people there. And
the density is exactly such that it's actually going to be very unusual to have more than one individual, one home per device.
Okay, cool.
There's one. We have one question, and I'd like to actually get this example on the table too. Jim, you've been involved in a deployment to the Yurok tribe in Northern California. Is that right? Could you speak about that a little bit?
Well, this is an area that we worked with the group back about 3 years ago in trying to find ways to get their river canyon, which is a very steep edges, and move sort of in an S-shaped pattern to try to find a way to get signals to some of the homes that were in that, along that canyon. There's lack of roads. Some of the people are accessing it through the river or through kind of back hills connections in. So there wasn't wired service at all. It needed to be wireless. And we did prove that the white space frequencies were able to penetrate a lot better than, let's say, 900 megahertz or other unlicensed services.
Thank you.
The other issue they had was infrastructure creation, and so we were able to do this project, with maybe 3 towers that were hidden in the trees versus, 9 towers that had to be exposed.
Well, from all of these examples, it's obvious that the use of TV white space technology has tremendous benefits, for educational uses, public access, as well as economic development. I think that was Andrew's point here. But I'd like to sort of probe a bit more about what are the opportunities for small business, women, and minority-owned businesses, and what role, besides the regulatory certainty, can the FCC play in encouraging participation, and what barriers exist for the wider deployment here? Nicole, would you like to address that?
Again, I think you all can hear me. Thank you for having me participate. So this is a really interesting conversation so far. I think being a person who's been chairing the FCC's Digital Diversity Committee on Unlicensed Spectrum. And one thing I would just like to put out there, and I'll talk about vulnerable communities from the standpoint of minority and low-income communities that tend to be in more dense populations, where you do have interference of concrete, old buildings, and other, it's not as open in terms of the space. having a more balanced approach to spectrum policy is something I think that should be inserted in this conversation, because we're going to need that, I think, to deploy the multiple technologies that we've been talking about. But in the case of minority-owned businesses and business owners, women business owners, and honestly vulnerable consumers, I think there's a couple of things that we have found to be interesting in the FCC Digital Diversity Committee with regards to how it contributes to, I think, 3 areas, one of which has already been discussed. Clearly, white space, and I see Michael Calabrese here because I was on a panel a couple years ago about this. So I do have some opinions. White space is clearly a great opportunity that complements unlicensed spectrum use. And in urban areas where there's not a lot of interference and there are unused channels that can be tapped into, it's a great place, a great way to get access to people. It's a lower barrier to entry for minority entrepreneurs that want to experiment with new applications, that want to get into, I think, an ecosystem that we've not traditionally been able to break into, which is this new Internet of Things. In all of the devices that are approved by the FCC in terms of compliance and the ones that are being innovated, minority entrepreneurs are less than 1% of those innovators. And for this type of burgeoning economy, we do have to solve that problem. And creating that lower barrier to entry, I think, allows, much like we're seeing with AirU and the libraries, it allows more people to play in this space, and they've not traditionally been able to do that. We did a non-empirical study at the Diversity Committee where we asked minority entrepreneurs if they even heard of unlicensed spectrum and if they ever used it, and the majority said no. They didn't know the opportunities. So again, I want to stress the lower barrier to entry really helps with training and really engaging folks in that area. I think the other piece of it is obviously in communities of color that are disproportionately low income, that it's an economic development driver, much like it's doing in rural communities. And again, if we can get channels open for people to leverage the white space or in some way combine it to a more balanced spectrum policy and approaches, I think we'll see a lot of successes. It's going to be critical. Not only are minorities consumers, that they actually, again, use these to develop different types of business opportunities and ventures in our communities, and that we find ways to get more entrepreneurs involved in that ecosystem. And we also find ways to connect small businesses in these neighborhoods. In prior work that I've done, where we were leveraging just simple community networks and Wi-Fi-based networks, that meant a lot to the small insurance company that could not get access at that time. I think now we're much more ubiquitous in these communities, but had challenges in ensuring that they could import out and export, import in and export out data to run their business. And then the third thing I think is public interest. We all have a goal, much like the FCC and the administration, of connecting our schools and libraries. And being able to use the white space to actually create, and I like, Joanne, what you were talking about in terms of the technology to create more supercharged hotspots in our communities. Churches, community centers, park districts, schools that may not be able to benefit from E-rate funding, what we've seen internationally in terms of success models, getting more devices that can be activated and energized in schools, I think is going to be a big challenge. And so leveraging the white space for vulnerable populations to actually use it for public interest, I think is really important as well. And I don't think we've seen enough, Paul, here in the United States in terms of those types of projects. I'll kind of put that out there. We want to see more of that. Yeah, we want to see more of that. We're talking about 99% of our nation's libraries and schools being connected. If we cannot get access into the classroom, or we can't get access, we don't have a lot of Starbucks in communities of color that are disproportionately low income. So we need to create other opportunities and other venues that can potentially leverage white space technology to bring that access. We're going to still have the problem of residential home broadband adoption, but if we can create those supercharged hotspots, whether through white space or unlicensed spectrum, I think we'll see much more value, and we'll actually see the social isolation that is somewhat of a barrier to these communities be broken. So this is a great opportunity, provided it's leveraged and it's calibrated in a way that we can actually do it and it can coexist to sort of lead us to better outcomes when it comes to broadband adoptions and relevance. So I'll put it out there if there's more. There's more I can say. But
that makes a lot of sense. Almost everybody has a smartphone these days, and you go to a hotspot wherever it is. So in these communities, that gives you internet and social connectivity. That's terrific.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I thought your comment was interesting about people not knowing about unlicensed, and I think that it's interesting because about maybe 10 years ago, our Office of Strategic Planning, they actually put out a white paper talking about unlicensed, and it was interesting because there was a little box vignette about all of the things that all of us encounter every day that are use unlicensed spectrum, and a lot of it people just aren't aware of.
Yes.
They don't realize that radio frequency is being used for certain devices, and even when you have a smartphone, you really have no idea what frequencies it's operating on.
No.
You just know that it works.
That's right. Well, I was going to say, for consumers, and particularly for minority consumers that over-index on the mobile internet, this whole process is so behind the scenes that as seamless as it can be,
Yes.
People are not monitoring whether or not they're jumping on a licensed, band or unlicensed band, if it's white space. They just want to know that it works, right? Wherever they are. And I think we have to create that continuity in communities of color, particularly when we're trying to bring public good applications to these communities that are welfare enhancing. So, if we cannot find ways to ensure that, and I think that Wall Street Journal article kind of woke up a lot of people with the mother sitting in the parking lot of McDonald's so that her child can finish homework. Mm-hmm. Those are horror stories that we actually have to break, because if we're trying to create a 21st century competitive workforce and learning environment and, more sustainable communities, et cetera, we've got to ensure that we can leverage these technologies to create full-fledged access. And I think, again, that's where we're seeing these projects that were discussed before that are really important. But I do want to stress that we have to get more minority entrepreneurs and women-owned businesses in this debate, because they are not there. And so to your point, Jerry, it was like when we did that survey, these were experienced entrepreneurs and innovators that were constantly engaged in the next best application. These were guys and women that had gone to Silicon Valley and had conversations with venture capitalists. Tom Reed can attest to that. But they didn't know anything about how to actually get into this space. And it's somewhat complicated if you're not an engineer, right? So there are different programs that we're pursuing on the subcommittee that can be helpful in raising awareness and education and doing more mentoring and partnering. But this ecosystem is beyond garage door openers and baby monitors. It's actually providing a really great portion of our economy, and we've got to ensure that minority and women-owned businesses are involved.
That sort of brings me to Elizabeth, because the WISPs use lots of different frequency bands, licensed and unlicensed, to reach all different kinds of communities. So, Elizabeth, speak to that point. And also, you told me before we started that you are a woman-owned company, which is rare.
Yeah. Yes, it is. I actually joke about it. I'm often the only girl in the room. But yes, we are a women-owned business. We're headquartered in Little Rock, Arkansas. My company, Aristotle, and of course, WISPA is the trade association that represents the fixed wireless industry. As an industry, WISPs tend to use any available spectrum. They predominantly serve rural areas, predominantly without government funds. It's basically predominantly the unserved and underserved communities. My company in specific does operate in the city of Little Rock, but most of our deployments are outside the city in the Delta and rural areas of Arkansas. And from our perspective, when we look at white space, it seems like this fantastic, promising hope that's going to address some problems that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. We have a community called Scott, Arkansas. It's historically African American. It's also a bedroom community of Little Rock. So you have side by side these farm communities with a bedroom community of the city. People go there, they want to be able to work from home. We've served that community with broadband since 2005, but there is an area of about 250 to 300 homes in an oxbow behind 150-foot trees that no spectrum available to us can reach, licensed or unlicensed. And so when we went to deploy our test of equipment, that's where we deployed it, and that's the test that we're currently running, because we look at white spaces giving us that opportunity. And when you talk about women businesses, minority businesses, and small businesses, all of that says rural to me. I know that there's a lot of issues in the urban areas, but when I look at the Spectrum Bridge database in Arkansas, I have plenty of channels available to me. I need to be able to bond them. I need to be able to get the speeds that my consumers expect to have. I need to have usable spectrum, but with that, I can reach these people. But all of the businesses in those communities that I serve are small businesses, and a lot of women-owned businesses are run out of the home. And so particularly in the Delta, you have experience of people who are quilters, and they'd only sell their product if someone happened to drive through the town, sort of like what you're talking about in Garrett County. When you get them on the internet, suddenly they have an international market, and you see the growth of business, you see the growth of industry, you see kids able to stay home in these small communities instead of having to move out. And we, looking at the tests that Carlson had done and some of the other things, we realized that our infrastructure costs could be roughly a third by deploying TV white space, which suddenly makes places more economically feasible. Places that right now, because of population density, are not, you can't make an economic case for them, suddenly become workable if TV white space is a usable spectrum that we can get sufficient bandwidth through. So that's kind of our perspective in a nutshell about the spectrum. And of course, I'd like to echo the need for balanced spectrum policy. I don't think there's a single answer. Honestly, I think the urban answer is different than the rural answer. I think whatever policy you enact has to take that into account. What's going to work for me in Arkansas is honestly probably not going to work in Manhattan and vice versa. So I think that that's important. And I think it's important to balance between licensed and unlicensed. And I think it's important to bear in mind that after the incentive auction is over, what is left over and the space we have at the end of the day needs to be, if not perfectly contiguous, at least perfectly usable. And I have to echo what Paul said, 30 megahertz at least in every market. That's our number. I mean, we think beyond that it's not going to be particularly helpful to the poor residents of Scott who need us and call me every single week.
So Harold, I know you've spoken on the availability of unlicensed spectrum, especially in the TV bands, and the importance of making sure that unlicensed has the space. I think Elizabeth's comments are a perfect jumping off point for you.
One of the things to keep in mind is, and I expect they'll get into this more in the next panel, is there are a lot of different ways to get to the right number that we're talking about. We don't need to be, I mean, obviously a big piece is going to be around the incentive auction of the band plan and what's left, and how we structure that. But even within there's a lot of flexibility depending on how we play it. The first step really has to be, I think, for all of us who are in the ecosystem who are not either the purchasers of the incentive auction licenses or the full power broadcasters who are going to be subject to the repacking, to understand that we're going to need to cooperate with each other to create a set of usable space, not just for the white spaces, but also wireless microphones, work it out with the low power television guys. I mean, the military and the broadcasters have agreed to share spectrum in the broadcast auxiliary space up by 2.1 in order to clear out more spectrum to auction down in 1755. If the military can put radar that guards our country's security and vital operations next to wireless microphones, and wireless microphones can live with that, I think that there is some space for some negotiation around here about how wireless microphones and TV white space operations can live together. The other critical points here are, this is kind of like shaking the change out of your couch in order to find what you need, but you can do it. We have ways to deal with the repacking. There are ways to deal with the guard bands and the duplex gap that I know people are going to discuss on the next panel. There's a re-examination of some of the rules now that we're more familiar with the technology. It's important to remember that the Commission has revisited the rules on basic Wi-Fi and unlicensed a bunch of times in order to expand the reach of of basic Wi-Fi. We had Wi-Fi comes out as Wi-Fi, the set of protocols, in 1999, and in 2003 the FCC says, hey, the rules we have about sort of power and transmission, if we take sectorized antennas and let you focus those beams more, you could effectively get more power and more reach now that you're using it for WISPs in a way that we never envisioned. And now that we understand the technology better, we can play with that. So we can look at some rules like the out-of-band emission limits, some of these other factors in this context, and say, hey, what could we tweak here or do over there that we're going to be comfortable with? What channels that we took off the table in an abundance of caution the first time around we could now start to put back on the table are going to give us that extra spectrum we need. And the final point I think I want to just make, pulling all of that together, is all of the things we've talked about don't happen unless there's a broader ecosystem that makes these devices dirt cheap. The reason why unlicensed is so dirt cheap and why this stuff has been so successful so far is because it's broadly available and there's a virtuous cycle. And that also has to do with the ecosystem and how the licensed and the unlicensed ecosystem actually enhance each other. I can remember 10 years ago when we were first talking about this, and it was like religious war. It's like either it was all about making this for licensed, and the unlicensed guys were just going to be dumping noise into the system, or if you were unlicensed, you believed that the future was here, and it was evil licensed guys who were creating artificial scarcity to be monopolists. And eventually, we realized spectrum's good, and you need a lot of pathways to access it, and you need to match the right use to the right type, whether it's licensed, unlicensed, whether it's TV white spaces band versus other Wi-Fi bands. We need a lot of this stuff. Like any real ecosystem, it needs a lot of variability and a lot of diversity to be sustainable. It's not just going to be big guys and little guys and nothing in between. As I often say, the problem is we can have a diverse system like the ocean that supports everything from giant blue whales down to krill. But if you let blue whales design the ecology, then the only thing you have is blue whales and krill, and the first question about anything else you throw in there is, how does that get me more krill? We need to be open to a lot of these things and not simply have one industry segment or another be asking, well, okay, rules nice, but how does that get me more krill?
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I think that sometimes the debate when you're talking about, what is the value of spectrum, or what is the value of this new service, with unlicensed, it's not always so obvious. It's yes, because we're not auctioning the spectrum, so we're not talking about how much money you're going to make in bidding. But it would be interesting if some of you just spoke to that. I mean, what's the difference? I mean, what's the impact here on competition? What's the impact here? What's the value proposition for unlicensed vis-a-vis the licensed services?
So I used to build radios, and we'd come up with some idea for a new application or service, and then we go out to Silicon Valley and say, okay, we've got this great idea, and we need $1 billion. And they go, why do you need $1 billion? Because, well, first we got to buy some spectrum, right? So when you've got an unlicensed model, I can go and say, well, you can knock a couple of zeros off that, because all I need to do is build the device and it'll scale. And if I get incredibly successful, I actually then have the option of saying, let me go see if I need or can get access to licensed spectrum. But the whole idea of how to develop wireless technologies, if you don't have that sandbox, if you like, of unlicensed, you can't start. So it starts right at the very beginning, even where Nicole was, in terms of how do you do something. If the entry point is giving you guys $1 billion or so for some spectrum before I can do anything, then it's a non-starter.
We have sponsored some economic studies on this, as have others, and to Harold's point earlier, it is a complementary technology to licensed. And just one data point from a recent paper by Richard Thankey, he looked at the issue of, okay, what would happen if unlicensed access were not available for mobile operators? What impact would that have on their infrastructure costs? And he's not the only one who's looked at this. There have been other studies, and there's obviously a direct relationship between the ability to offload data onto unlicensed, for example, and a reduction in the total amount of capex that a mobile operator has to devote to network deployment. That's one example. I mean, there are many others, but there definitely is. There definitely is. I mean, I think it can't be that there's no economic value to this, right? And so there obviously is some, and there's been some measurements done. I think the picture is somewhat incomplete so far, but that's an obvious one on offload.
Harold? Elizabeth?
Sorry, I'd actually like to say one thing to that point, which is that there have been studies that have tried to characterize the value of unlicensed spectrum, and I've seen numbers anywhere from $17 billion to $21 billion a year, because what you're really talking about is innovation. There's so much more innovation within the unlicensed spectrum, and you also, therefore, are enabling small businesses. You are enabling companies that came out of nowhere. I mean, Ubiquiti, which is a multi-billion-dollar company, exists because of unlicensed spectrum. And they're headquartered in California. What basketball team did he buy? They've got a 32-year-old or 35-year-old CEO, and that company wouldn't exist, and none of those jobs would exist except for the fact of unlicensed spectrum. And I don't think that can be overlooked. I agree it's a balance, just like everything else. You have to have license. You do. It's necessary. But having the unlicensed spaces usable and open really is what drives incredible innovation in this country, and that innovation drives the growth of business and economic development.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to comment that this whole concept and model here with TV white space is kind of new technology sharing. It's really dynamic spectrum access, and we have it here. We think maybe this can go in other bands too. And, so the kind of work that you folks are doing is really kind of proofing this model for us. And I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. But.
I actually do. Sorry. I just want to say that I view this whole exercise that you're going through at the FCC as an enormous opportunity for you to do some substantial good for large parts of this country who up to now have had difficulty getting broadband access. I think it presents an enormous opportunity, and I'm really grateful that you're having this workshop and that you all are so focused on it, because I think it presents, for the reasons you just stated, an awesome opportunity to help move the country forward economically and to bring us a little more at parity, competitively speaking, on an international basis with countries that are actually outflanking us quite effectively in broadband.
Go on that, but also, again, tie in not only the economic growth, but the social growth. Having sections of the society disconnected has a tremendous cost to the country. And closing that gap, if you will, has a cascading impact, if done in a sustainable fashion, will have those sections of society begin to contribute and further innovate. Not doing that is a tremendous cost. It puts us in certain cases in a non-competitive environment. And I do think that while there are economic considerations clearly to make, that there is a societal and social consideration that should be in parallel. It is a disservice to parts of the country to simply be in the dark. In some cases, that's literal, in the dark. An information age where you're disconnected from information is really a detriment that itself cascades in the wrong direction.
Right.
So I do think the value proposition is there, and as a country, it is a social good that should be fully exercised, given the opportunities. I think the value proposition is there for any of the providers, any of the entities, if you will, that heretofore had not seen perhaps a economic return on investment sufficient to warrant looking at these communities, but both individually and in the aggregate, it's an investment that needs to be made.
I'd like to add one more thing, too. Oh, and I was just going to say, and I agree with what Robert actually said, so I echo that. But I'm looking at, having sitting next to Peter and looking at these really innovative plugins that he has over here that operate for white space, I think there's also a case to be made for some trials or experiments with white space technology, much like we've seen in libraries and underserved schools or in more contained environments like churches or community centers, where I think this type of technology, as we're still trying to learn its stability and learn more about how the technology actually operates. Because to Robert's point, one of the things at MMTC that we actually don't want to see in my prior work is we don't want to turn people on to have them be turned off, at any certain point, right? And you don't want to set the expectation that broadband will deliver all of these great promises, but the technologies that are deployed in these communities are not consistent and not able to empower them to get to the next level of that transformation, particularly if you start getting into more complex applications like telehealth, et cetera, that will require us to really address issues related to spectrum scarcity in this country. But I think these devices that you have here sitting next to me are interesting, right? Particularly when we're trying to bring more educational devices and tablets into schools, to maybe look at ways for the FCC to trial those. And I know the FCC has trialed several different projects, but to maybe look at ways to bring in some of these devices to see that they actually work in a school. Can we actually enable a community center? Can we look at a park district that can provide access or become a second place for learning for this community? Can we take a workforce development center and engage them with these devices to ensure this continuous learning environment? I mean, the digital ecosystem has changed from PCs, sitting in front of PCs and keyboards now, and they've become much more dynamic. So I'd like to see something like that, I think, from the FCC that might take us a little further in what the power of this new white space technology will be as it has advanced, Michael, over the last few years, and its potential, and to make sure it's consistently able to deliver to the communities that we're trying to engage.
Well, I think we're kind of running. Or do you have another one?
Well, Harold, I think
I don't want to.
Harold will be the last, and then we have one question.
Just one or couple of quick hits. One, absolutely, the TV white space itself and this technology, which is the next generation of, we talk about 4G LTE. This is essentially 2G unlicensed. It is the next step up that enables a whole new universe of cognitive sharing to enhance efficiency, and those ideas about how to enhance efficiency are already directly benefiting the licensed community by allowing for more sharing to clear space for licensing, and as with other things, will benefit the licensed community as they incorporate these technologies for more efficient licensed use as well. The other last point I want to make about this with regard to the social good conversation that people have been having here and the economic is, it is enormously empowering for communities to be able to do this themselves. For people like Elizabeth, like Nicole, who, when I first met her, was working on a project in Chicago by the old Sears Tower to use traditional Wi-Fi to try to bring connectivity to that community. To not have to go on bended knee to the big providers and say, please, sir, please take an interest in my poor little community that you have overlooked. We're really worth it. But to be able to say, forget that, I'm going to do this myself, is just a social good that cannot be valued in dollars, but is absolutely critical to the spirit of this country.
Thank you, Harold. Okay, as I said, we're kind of running out of time. I have one question, and it's fortunately a short answer, but it's how many white space radios have been authorized by the FCC? Right now we have 5 that have been authorized. We have a number that are in the process. Jim also has a number of devices that he has developed that in the experimental context. I anticipate that at some point then we'll see authorizations in that area too. But we're getting plenty of new equipment coming on, so... yeah, that's not a problem. So I want to thank all of our panelists. I think this has been just terrific discussion. I know I've learned a lot of things, and I work in white space quite a lot, I'll tell you that. So if we could have just a round of applause for them all. Thank you very much, guys. Okay. Oh, that was a good panel.
Actually, it was a good panel.
That was great.
So we'll have a short break. We'll pick up at 11:15, and and have the second panelists come up to be ready to go at 11:15. Thanks.
Could we have people sit down? We'll start the second panel, please. We're going to go ahead and get started with the second panel. The moderators for our second panel will be Julie Knapp, who's the chief of our Office of Engineering and Technology, and Ira Keltz, who's the deputy chief there. Thank you.
So welcome back, everybody. Our second panel is going to have a little bit more of a technical focus, and we have got another great group of people that have been doing terrific things. Some are in the space already, and so part of this will be educational for people who may not really be familiar with all the details of the current operations that are there. And with that, I'll have Ira maybe just introduce the panelists.
Thanks, and I want to thank everybody for being here, our audience, our panelists, and I think we should have a real good, robust discussion. By way of introduction, real quick, and then we'll get this kicked off. We have a very distinguished panel. Sitting immediately to my left is Michael Bergman, who's Senior Director of Technology and Standards for the Consumer Electronics Association. We've got Mark Bruner, who's Shure's Senior Deputy Director of Global Brand Management. He's also currently President of the Professional Audio Manufacturers Alliance and has been active working both with the Commission and internationally on spectrum issues related to wireless microphones. Michael Calabrese, who's with the Wireless Futures Project, New America Foundation, which is a nonprofit think tank here in D.C. And he has been developing and advocating policies promoting ubiquitous broadband connectivity and more efficient spectrum use, including for unlicensed devices and the TV whitespace devices. He's been very active. We have Andrew Clegg, who's Program Director at the National Science Foundation's Electromagnetic Spectrum Management Unit and responsible for access to spectrum for NSF-funded services, including radio astronomy, which one of the bands they operate is on TV channel 37. Tom Dombrowski, who's a senior engineering advisor with the law firm of Wiley Ryan, where he provides technical advice and guidance to many clients on wireless spectrum matters, including many of the wireless carriers. Mark Gibson, Director of Business Development for ComSearch. He has been prime in leading ComSearch efforts, working with the American Society for Healthcare Engineering and their technical partner in the wireless medical telemetry devices, which also, as we heard in the last panel, also operate on TV channel 37. Alan Norman, who is a member of Google's Access Strategy team as a principal. He's been very involved with access initiatives, including TV whitespace, spectrum, and helping develop Google's wireless access strategy. Robert Seidel, who's the VP of Engineering and Advanced Development for CBS TV Corporation. And Haiyan Tang, who is the CEO of Adaptrum. Haiyan co-founded Adaptrum and is, considered by many experts as a leading technologist in the area of cognitive radio and TV whitespace. And with that,
so just a couple of quick reminders for the panelists. Be sure to speak into your mic so it can be picked up for the webcast. And for the audience, again, the questions as the time allows, we'll have the availability of the note cards, and by remote, send an email to livequestions@fcc.gov. To kick this off, I thought it would be helpful to talk, I'll tell you what the four areas to start with. Maybe a little bit more about TV whitespace. What are the things that the products and visions that we see there that maybe we didn't cover in the first panel? Learn a bit more about the wireless medical telemetry. Also about the wireless mics and radio astronomy. So we're going to get to each of the areas. So no need to be concerned we're going to neglect everything. And I know there's a lot of other services in this space, but this is what we're covering here today. So maybe on the white space side, Alan or Hein, anybody, things that you want to add to what we heard about in the earlier panel?
You want to go? Adaptron is a Silicon Valley-based company. We're actively developing TV white space technology. We have a device already certified by FCC, and then we have a few more devices coming in the pipeline. So I think overall, you can see more and more devices becoming available. And of course, on the database side, Google gets recently certified, and there's going to be a lot more also coming. So I guess we will see a wave of, TV white space device and database become available in the coming months.
Anything to add about the range and the bandwidths and the data rates that we had talked about earlier?
Actually, we're working with Microsoft in the Kenya project. Yeah, some of the data that we see, is similar to what Paul described. Over 16 megabit over 8 megahertz channel, and depending on the terrain, tree, the obstacles, you go anywhere between a few kilometer to 10 kilometer range. And then, of course, you can do channel bounding, contiguous or non-contiguous, and then the number, the total bandwidth is going to be multiplied based on how many channel you bound.
Alan, did you?
Yeah, I'd be happy to add a couple points there, Julie. So first of all, I know Paul had mentioned 802.11af. I want to make sure people understand that standard was just recently completed, will be published either late this year or early next year, and that's very significant. Because what that means in Wi-Fi, you'll now be able to see not only operation probably in a single piece of silicon, Operation 2, 4, and 5, but now also the ability to get the range extension or the lower power that you can get in the UHF band. And so, think about it. It's either 2.5 times the range, which translates to 6x the coverage, or a fraction of the power, all other things being kept equal. So that's very significant. For that to happen, however, we need, some of the issues that were already discussed about having certainty, about how much spectrum is available. Doesn't have to be contiguous. Knowing that it will be available nationwide are critical to get people to actually go ahead and build products. Some of the applications that you might see that we don't see now, Metro Wi-Fi has a challenge where you're going from, say, a light pole and trying to get indoors. The 15 dB in gain that you get just because of the propagation, the characteristics of the spectrum, can now make that possible. We did a deployment in Mountain View, California, to understand how, what it take to make Wi-Fi work. And one of the challenges really was there's just too much noise in the 2.4. We just see too many things, and we weren't able to get indoors. So it was really limited to outdoor on the street. Another example is indoor low power. All sorts of applications you could see there, and it's really the propagation again that makes that possible. And a third one is that wasn't mentioned before, and we're big supporters of last mile access, but it's indoor backhaul, connecting devices in the home. This is not a replacement for the current uses of Wi-Fi, for example, but really a way to eliminate wires when you want to get from your basement to where maybe your cable modem is coming to where you might actually want to put your Wi-Fi access point, for example, and those are some other examples.
Great. And Michael?
Ellen made a very important point in mentioning the 802.11af standard in development because, I think as most folks know, there's really two very different flavors of unlicensed access to the TV band, right? There is fixed wireless, which uses the 802.22 standard, which is already finalized. So most of what we heard on the first panel was about fixed wireless. And that's already happening in rural areas. You heard about Air.U's deployment at West Virginia University and so on. What you have is you're using white space really as long distance Ethernet. You're going white space to Wi-Fi, and then you rebroadcast it as Wi-Fi in the very localized area, which is great. Although much more powerful will be the other flavor of
of unlicensed is online, which is for personal portable devices, the 802.11af, because when that's integrated into chipsets, as Alan said, then consumers will have a direct air interface with TV whitespace. So if you broadcast connectivity, for example, West Virginia University has fiber, has no outdoor Wi-Fi really to speak of. They could very cheaply broadcast, and it's a huge sprawling campus with hills and trees and this personal rapid transit system. They could tomorrow, Hayun, who's Adaptrum has base stations on their engineering building, could blanket the campus and the downtown area even with direct connectivity for devices if we had that. But what that will take, I think in practical terms, and the industry people like Alan can speak to this better, is that you really need not only regulatory certainty, but a substantial number of 6 megahertz blocks in every market in the nation, including places like New York City and Los Angeles. So while we acknowledge that the incentive auctions, because of the auctions and because of the repacking, will inevitably reduce the total amount of unlicensed access in the TV bands, the silver lining of this proceeding, potentially, is to ensure something on the order of 30 megahertz in every market nationwide. Because if you have that substantial amount, that's critical for developing markets of national scope and scale, not only for chips, but then for devices, applications, and services. And that's how Wi-Fi really boomed, and that's how Super Wi-Fi can do the same.
So we're going to get into more of the technical trade-offs between the different services that are there in a minute. But let's keep going down the line here. And on wireless medical telemetry, Mark, maybe you can educate us a bit about that. We did read all the comments, but I thought everybody would want to hear.
Well, so for those who've read the comments, this will be sort of a Cliff Notes version of it. But WMTS, or Wireless Medical Telemetry Service, is a service that was licensed by established by the Commission back in 2000-2001. And it is primarily for, if not exclusively for, connecting patients to monitoring. It's primarily for heart monitoring, but you can monitor other parameters, including blood oxygen and breathing and whatnot. Like I said, it's licensed by rule, so that the existence in a database is what gives one the ability to operate, or at least the FCC a clearance to operate. And that database is maintained by ASHE, the American Society for Healthcare Engineering. And so by virtue of these devices being in that database, that gives them the regulatory approval to operate. The WMTS, as Julie said in the send-up to the beginning of all these panels, it started out as an unlicensed service. So, to the extent that the hospitals understand unlicensed, they certainly understand it in that realm and in others. And the idea behind it was because of, this is well documented, an interference situation that occurred with a TV station operating. Actually, they were testing their DTV signal in channel 38, and it was interfering with a WMT or a telemetry system. It wasn't WMTS at the time in Baylor, and that's known as the Baylor incident. So there'll probably be a documentary someday on television about that. But bottom line is that that necessitated the Commission establishing spectrum for wireless medical telemetry service. And so now what is it used for? Well, it's used for patients with varying degrees of acuity or illness. Everything from presenting at the emergency room with a trauma to critically ill or terminally ill patients being monitored with their with heart monitored in the ICU or the CCU. And there's even some applications for neonatal care as well. And so the use runs the gamut of just about anything for some type of patient illness throughout the hospital, including critical care, terminal care, and even end-of-life care to some extent. So that's did I miss anything?
Oh, I think that does it. Andy, maybe a little bit about radio astronomy?
Okay. Thanks, Julie. So this mysterious thing called radio astronomy, we use very sensitive antennas and receivers to listen to natural radio emissions coming from what are typically very distant cosmic sources. We do this to study the field of astronomy and gather information about the cosmos and the origin of the universe and other interesting phenomena. We typically conduct these observations from radio telescope sites that are fairly remote. In this particular band, we're talking about TV channel 37, it's allocated on a primary basis to radio astronomy. And we make use of that allocation at approximately 13 sites across the country. And I say approximately because it sort of depends on what the definition of is. Some sites are actively observing in that band. Some sites are equipped to observe, but the receiver is not literally on the telescope at all times. Other observatories are planning to observe and other things. But approximately 13 sites around the country observe in the 608 to 614 megahertz band. We use cryogenically cooled low noise amplifiers as our first component in the system, and we also integrate for long periods of time to get our noise level down to very low levels. And because of this, we are very sensitive to interference. The ITU is established in Recommendation 769, sort of an interference threshold for radio astronomy in the different bands. And in this particular band, across the 6 megahertz channel, some of our telescopes have interference thresholds of about minus 172 dBm, and others have an interference threshold, different type of telescope, down to about neg 131 dBm. So I just put that out there to explain the level of sensitivity we have to interference from either adjacent channel TV stations, which are what we're faced with now, the potential for adjacent channel TV white space type systems that we may be faced with more in the future. And even I noticed the NPRM suggested the possibility of co-channel unlicensed devices, which we think would be a big challenge for us to work with. But having said that, we only operate at these few sites. Most of them are very remote, not high density areas because we're trying to avoid RFI. There are some sites where we can't get away from population densities like Hawaii or Puerto Rico or U.S. Virgin Islands, but for the most part we operate in fairly remote areas.
Great. Go ahead, Mike.
You know, I'd like to add that there's also a good discussion of these levels and issues in the 1995 NPRM on radio astronomy protection. 9517, I think, is the number. Anyway. So I'd recommend it to anybody who's interested in that topic.
Great. Let's talk about wireless mics for a second. Who wants to go first?
Speaking through a wired microphone to you today, Julie. Julie, as you know, and most of the folks here know, the wireless microphone is the original white space device, taking advantage of the unused spectrum between television channels and authorized under Part 74 by the FCC in the 70s. Wireless mics are a part of content creation, program making, and special events, as they refer to it in Europe, and in all walks of life. Wireless professional audio equipment is deployed across a variety of industries, the hotel and convention center, the church, the large house of worship, the mega church, which we would call, and then the more familiar applications that we see in live events, touring concert productions, Broadway shows, and of course, broadcast production, which was its original home. The wireless microphones have utilized a variety of UHF spectrum over the years. The equipment is coordinated by professionals in most cases, and has been used without interference to over-the-air broadcast virtually since their inception. What has happened with wireless professional audio products, as more and more content creation has taken advantage of wireless technology and audiences have demanded this globally, more and more products have been created in the UHF spectrum due to those allocations being similar globally. So Shure and its competitors have developed a lot of equipment based on UHF technology, taking advantage of the propagation that is beneficial to all of these other products. In recent years, the 700 megahertz auction took quite a bit of available spectrum for professional audio off the table. And we worked closely with you and with the Commission to devise a set of interoperability rules to utilize the remaining TV white space. And we were very, very big proponents of the database concept because we thought it it addressed one important issue, which was the temporal and the geolocation basis of the use of these pro audio products, and knowing that they're going to be in a certain location at a certain set of times, sharing was possible. But of course, the large number of unlicensed wireless microphones required a more consistent day-to-day operating space, and that was created by the allocation of the two channels in each market. So, and now we're in discussions on the incentive auction proceeding about the maintenance of those channels and how they might be further shared, and what operating rules would have to put in place around that. A wireless microphone is used live and in real time, which makes it fundamentally different from all of these other uses. And there's no second chance at a live performance. You can't resend the data packet. It happens, and the moment is gone. So this nature, and in addition, the high fidelity, full frequency response, real time audio nature of a wireless microphone or pro audio product puts a special set of requirements around its protections for consistent operation.
Good. Bob, why don't you talk a little bit about broadcasters and how they use wireless mics?
I'll discuss essentially how we use wireless microphones in our various areas of business, as well as some of our experiences using the database. CBS operates many variety of businesses, including CBS News, our 29 owned and operated television stations that provide free over-the-air television, CBS Entertainment Division that makes programs not only for CBS but for other groups. For example, in New York City, we have Black Entertainment Network in our studios. We're producing a show for NBC, for Fox. So we produce a variety of shows for different networks using wireless technology, microphone technology. We also use it in our sports application, and we work quite closely with the NFL to coordinate use of wireless microphones. You see the referee on the field calling the play, whether it was out of bounds or he was down. That's a wireless microphone. So as a result, it permeates our business essentially. But probably the most unique application of this, and we've participated in the IEEE 802 committees quite actively, and we believe in sharing. But there are certain circumstances when we don't know where the event's going to take place. I can predict when David Letterman is going to do his show, and I can put that into the database. I can predict that I'm going to be at the United Nations, or I can predict that I'm going to be at the Capitol building. I can predict that I'm going to be at the stadium. These are known things that I can put into the database, and I can say we're going to be using these frequencies during that period. What I can't predict, and I have no way of knowing 48 hours in advance, where the plane is going to crash on the Hudson, where the gunman is going to attack at the Navy Yard, where the bombing is going to take place in Boston. In those instances, in many cases, World Trade Center collapsing, we are the first responders on site. It's the local television stations providing essential information to the public free of charge. Many times what happens, like in the Boston bombing, people were in chaos. They didn't know what was going on. It was the local broadcasters, not the networks, but the local broadcasters providing vital public information as to what was going on. The first thing that happened was the cell phone networks became clogged. We couldn't even put in the latitude and longitude of the attack into the database, let alone wait 48 hours for that database data to trickle down to the devices. So as a result, we need the two channels that we currently have in the future proceedings. These two channels give us a way to share the spectrum among a variety of broadcasters. For example, in New York City, we share channels with ABC, with Telemundo, with a lot of other broadcasters. So when we show up on site, we are all sharing those channels. We play well with others. We're willing to share the white space, but there are, on these breaking news instances, it's the local free over-the-air television station that's not only providing the broadcast over-the-air free, it's going to cable, it's going to satellite, it's going to the internet. I can watch our stations on phones, mobile devices. I can watch it on the Wi-Fi here. So we are going to locations, not just free over-the-air broadcasts, but we serve as dissemination for many avenues. Typically, CNN, a cable network, will sign up a local television station to be an access point for them because they can't get a crew on site quickly enough. So we'll dispatch on a typical day about 30 news crews around the city that are gathering news. And a lot of times we'll show up at the same locations. But there's many times where we can't know where the news is going to happen. Typically, our news assignment desk will pick locations where they know they're going to have news. The mayor will be speaking. The president will be speaking. The election headquarters. But there are times that we don't know. And it's those times that we need these two channels because we're not only sharing amongst ourselves, we're sharing with Broadway, we're sharing with churches, we're sharing with other people. So having these two dedicated channels really enables us to cover the news accurately. Recently, we tried to enter database information that said we're going to be using our microphones at our studios 24/7. And many times we not only do, 11 o'clock and 6 o'clock, we'll do continuous news broadcasts. We tried to enter in the database state capitol. We tried to enter federal courthouse. We tried to enter the Denver Health and Medical Center, the National Jewish Hospital, Presbyterian Hospital. And surprisingly, we were told that our database entries were not valid and were deleted. This is a problem because these are places that we know we're going to be covering news. We know we're going to be covering protesters outside the courthouse. This is part of our job is to report and provide public information free of charge. This is what we do. So as a result, we were very surprised when some of our database entries were deleted, saying we can't cover the federal courthouse. So we're a little perplexed by that. And part of the news gathering operation is not known. As I said, we don't know when the news is going to happen in these, and in many cases, we are the first responders. During the World Trade Center collapse, our crews were on site and were actually running from debris clouds as the buildings were coming down, or we're on site where the ammonia car has derailed. We don't know where that's going to happen. It happens, it's live action news, and you have to inform the public of what's happening. And for those reasons, we need these two assigned channels.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. So we've heard all the various and diverse services that are operating within the TV band, and in addition to the medical telemetry, the radio astronomy, the microphones, and broadcasting, as we march down the road to incentive auctions, we're looking at adding in wireless broadband service too. So let's kind of jump, I guess, to the crux of one of the issues that the Commission is always wrestling with, and certainly in this proceeding, coexistence of these various services. And as we are looking at developing the band plan and looking at how to create a spectral environment to support all these various services, what are some of the critical points that the various panelists see that we need to consider, and the various trade-offs as we march down this, looking at things of spectrum availability versus guard band size versus out-of-band emissions, and so on and so forth.
Go ahead. We can go right down the line, too, if everybody wants to talk.
Thank you. CEA is studying this. We have commissioned a paper through Hogan Lovells and Spectrum Management Consulting to look at the different issues of coexistence. And the things that we're getting out of this process, by the way, we'll be presenting that hopefully in a few weeks. So the things that we're getting out of this, I think one of the bigger items that comes out of this is you have to bounce the coexistence issues that you're familiar with in other comparable bands like 700 megahertz with market variability, because what market variability does, and we recognize the critical nature of market variability in terms of a successful auction. Market variability being I'm probably not saying anything that everyone in this room already knows, but market variability being the ability to adjust the amount of spectrum cleared and repacked on a market-by-market basis to avoid the lowest common denominator effect of having to accommodate only a fixed amount of spectrum nationwide. But what happens when we look at that, particularly we're looking in the context of the Down from 51 plan, what happens is the fixed filter banks, where cell phones or televisions typically assume that they can use a fixed filter to select for their band, it challenges that model. And so what's going to be happening is we're going to be seeing less rejection for some of the consumer electronics devices that we're familiar with in terms of protecting those devices from the adjacent services, licensed or unlicensed. So that's a challenge. And that challenge will go out to the engineers. Now, we've said that in our comments, we've said that the rules for the repack should be based on currently available technologies, not things that are projected for some years from now. And I haven't heard that that's an unreasonable position. When we look at the services that are in this discussion, the four technologies that we've just discussed, plus television, mobile phone, radio astronomy, and WMTS. Some of them have some geographic advantages. Radio astronomy, Andrew mentioned that they do have 13, more or less, sites to protect. And those, we believe, with our understanding, can have a certain amount of set aside where they can say, look, you can't use a wireless microphone. We're doing a 20-minute integration right now. WMTS, again, usage is in a hospital facility on a campus. So there's some opportunities to protect some of these devices, or some of these services. When you have an antenna sitting up on a tower at a distance, such as a LTE base station or a TV transmitter, there's also some natural advantages. Even if you get in close, the antenna may be putting the signal primarily over your head rather than straight down at you. So there, some of these geographic, I'm speaking in generalities. We'll get a little bit more specific when we actually get into the paper, and I can speak to specifics in the Q&A. But what we end up with is that you do have some cases where if you put a transmitter and a receiver in close proximity, within a few meters or 10 meters, even with a wall in between them, we may see some conflicts. So there's going to be careful consideration required in terms of looking at some of those combinations. Thank you.
Let's go next. Go ahead, Michael.
Say what? Let me address the on the wireless microphones.
Yeah, sure.
I think it should be fairly straightforward to address the sort of needs that that Bob outlined. But first, it's important to keep in mind that a majority of TV channels in each local market are not available for unlicensed use. And unlicensed devices typically cannot use the vacant channels used by broadcasters in neighboring TV markets, even at the lowest power, even at 40 milliwatts. And what's good about this is it creates the possibility for a real win-win. That is, we could have a three-prong policy that can ensure that both wireless mic operators and unlicensed broadband users have a sufficient amount of low-band spectrum available. We outlined this in the comments we filed on behalf of the Public Interest Spectrum Coalition. But sort of, to summarize a bit, first, and probably most important, is to expand the number of locally vacant TV channels that are available to microphones that are not currently available to unlicensed spectrum. Second is to maintain the 2 reserve channels for microphones, but open them for sharing by unlicensed devices at places and times they're not in use. Because even if there's a concentration of use on Broadway, or even if there's a hurricane somewhere, in 99% of the places and times that spectrum is vacant. And then third is to require microphone operators to use these TV co-channels that are not available for unlicensed devices before they fall back onto 2 reserve channels. And to really understand this, I think it's important to just double back on that first point about expanding the channels for microphones, because mics have a long and successful history of operating co-channel with TV stations in distant and neighboring markets. Julie and OET found this during the original white space testing at FedEx Field, where they found the microphones were operating co-channel to local TV stations in Washington. Why? Because nobody was watching television in the stadium, so they had no problem doing that. In practice, so under current rules, mics must be at least 70 miles from a television transmitter. In practice, microphone operators operate at considerably shorter separation distances, particularly indoors, like at studios. So just to give an example, which we kind of detail in our comments, at Rockefeller Center in New York City, home to NBC Universal Studios, while there is no channel available for unlicensed use, according to the Spectrum Bridge database, not one, there's microphones have at least 18 vacant TV channels effectively available. So, for example, there are 6 that are between 50. There are 6 channels that microphones often use that are occupied by distant market TV stations that are between 50 and 70 miles distant from the Rockefeller Center. And when you add the fact that they're indoors, there's certainly no risk of interfering with television in New Haven from a microphone at NBC Studios. And as a result of that, what you see is that when you look in the database, in the TV white space database, you see that NBC Universal regularly reserves neighboring market TV channels that are less than 70 miles away. For example, when we looked back in January, they had reserved in the database 5 channels that were where the TV stations were less than 15 miles from their studio, and this has never been a problem. I would add to this that, and so what this effectively does is it means that microphones have plenty of places to go if we just kind of make explicit what has been the common practice, is use these out-of-market TV channels where unlicensed devices are banned, and go there first, and let the TV bans database sort of regulate this, which would be a bonus to the win-win, because then it would help the microphones coordinate with each other if there's this transparent registry in a sense. So like with NBC Universal, they can just look in the database and see which ones they're using so they can use others. A final point, which, because I think Mark might want to speak to it, is we in our reply comments, we said we agree wholeheartedly with Sennheiser, and I think Shure maybe supports this, to go even beyond that, go beyond shortening the separation distance for microphones, to allow microphones to operate at locations, and I'm quoting Sennheiser, to operate at locations where a TV signal is below a specified threshold. In other words, when you're inside the NBC Universal Studios, there's no reason even to say, oh, well, it has to be 30 miles, 40 miles. They should just measure the signal. And if there's no effective TV signal there, use that channel. And in fact, the TV stations do that. The microphone operators do that all the time. You saw it at the inaugural, where they reserved even local DC broadcast channels for microphone use in the Spectrum Bridge database, because it's not really bothering anybody.
So let's. I know there's going to be another point of view on this, but I want to give some others a chance to talk, and so you can get a chance to respond, because we were talking about the coexistence and what's on your mind. Andy, if you. Yeah, we'll get down the line, so you'll get a chance.
So I'll just say quickly, our concern about the coexistence issue is. Even if in the final ruling you do nothing with Channel 37 and radio astronomy is still allocated and land mobile for WMTS is allocated, we're concerned that there will be increasing crowding on the adjacent channels, because you'll have fewer TV channels to pack in the remaining TV stations. And when you look at the rules, A full power DTV station, a 1.6 megawatt EIRP DTV station, can transmit up to 55 watts of out-of-band emissions in the immediately adjacent channel. And when you try to propagate 55 watts down to the negative 172 dBm interference criterion for a radio telescope, if you just take some random propagation model that takes terrain into account and plug that in, you're typically looking at several hundred kilometers to reach that level. So we would have trouble coexisting with high power adjacent channel DTV stations. If it's an adjacent channel base station for LTE or something like that, they're allowed about 5 dBm of out-of-band emissions in the immediately adjacent channel. And depending on all the particulars, you're still looking at somewhere on the order of 40 to over 100 kilometers separation to meet those ITUR recommended levels. So our concern is, even if nothing happens to channel 37, that we hope that there is some consideration given to the increasingly congested neighboring channels to channel 37.
But what about base stations?
Well, so that LTE base station, they're the ones that are allowed 5 dBm of power in the adjacent 6 channels. Now, a mobile station is a little easier, but it's still 15 to 70 kilometers, depending on what you assume for various characteristics. And the TV white space or unlicensed devices, because there's no specific rules for some of the things that were proposed in the NPRM, can't really give you an exact figure, but we still think it's going to be several tens to maybe over 100 kilometers, depending on the nature of a TV white space type operation. And it could be worse if it's a co-channel type of thing.
Andy, can I just clarify just one point there?
Sure.
When you're giving those distances and the interference criteria, I believe that's just for a single dish, which are only a handful of sites, and then you have a bunch of sites that are networked together.
Right.
That I believe have a more lenient interference threshold.
Right. So I gave a range there, and the lower part of that range was for the interferometers, which have the lower threshold. So very quickly, an adjacent channel DTV station, assuming the maximum amount of out-of-band emissions, for the interferometer, we're looking at 125 kilometer separation. For an adjacent channel base station, like an LTE base station, according to the rules as far as out-of-band emissions go, for the interferometer, we're looking at a 40 kilometer separation. For an adjacent channel mobile broadband mobile station, we're looking at about 15 kilometers, and the difference there is mostly because we assumed the mobile station was only at a 2 meter height, whereas the base station we assumed 100 meter height. And the TV white space device, we looked at the in-band issue because in the NPRM it said, maybe share channel 37 with TV white spaces. Again, it depends on all the assumptions you make, but if you're looking at a 4-watt type of device a few meters off the ground, we're looking at 75 kilometers or so. And again, those numbers, don't hold me to those exact numbers, but those are sort of the sanity checks we got in ballpark.
Tom.
Yes, I'm here today representing CTIA, and CTIA has members both in the licensed as well as the unlicensed community. As Ira indicated, there's a lot of trade-offs that go into this band plan. CTIA in the record has sort of suggested an approach that focuses on getting as much licensed paired spectrum as possible out of the band plan and limiting guard bands to technically reasonable amounts, 10 to 12 megahertz for duplex gap, and small guard bands to support no interference among different parties. I think the follow-on point that would be helpful in terms of moving this debate forward a little bit would be having a discussion of the technical parameters that the unlicensed guys will be using in these guard bands. LTE parameters are fairly well understood. In fact, we had a long discussion and debate about it in the CSMAC process, so if folks want to see what LTE protection requirements are, they're there and available, and in fact, a number of the folks here have participated in that process. So what would be helpful is to understand and have in the record, I think, sort of power levels, out-of-band emission limits, what sort of operations they're looking at in these guard bands, and it could be dependent on the amount of spectrum that's available or not. But that would, I think, help move the discussion along further if we can get some more concrete technical data supported in the record for that.
Okay, moving down the line. like radio astronomy, WMTS is sort of operates sort of on the hairy edge of link margin, which is one of the reasons the Commission considered putting it in the Channel 37 band to begin with. And while radio astronomy is passive, obviously WMTS is active. And so you've got situations where you've got hospital-wide distributed antenna systems. Everywhere a patient could be, there is the ability to have coverage for WMTS. And so that's every nook and cranny where a patient could end up. And as I said earlier, patients can often present in the ER, and so they're down there. One of the issues of presenting in that location is that the ERs generally tend to be out away from, or at least someplace not protected by the hospital building, and so you don't enjoy the benefit of having a building penetration loss. So you've got to, and the reason these systems operate with such low margins is a combination of things to balance the link, but low to protect battery power as well. You've got a device that can cost roughly $10,000, so they have very specific types of battery technologies that they use to ensure that they don't have to keep replacing batteries all the time. So the issues with interference with WMTS are really the same that Andy addressed. Adjacent channel, the concerns are for television, issues that WMTS faces right now with respect to dealing with adjacent channel television. There's some 50 markets right now where there are 50 areas of the country where there is TV on one side or the other. And so the way the WMTS, and about 8 markets, I believe, or 8 or 11, I forget, markets where there's TV on both sides. And the interference, or the issues of interference with, or avoidance of interference with TV is fairly well documented. And so and it's on the record that the coalition, the WMTS coalition, filed. What the WMTS community does, and this is primarily the equipment manufacturers in concert with the hospitals, they build in guard bands. The rules require for operation at 608 that you do what's called quarter band, which all of us that are engineers understand. You just pick 1.5 meg channels, and that's how it has to be operated. And so if there's a TV above or below, TV station above or below, what the hospital does is they build in a 1.5 meg guard band. And sometimes it can be as much as 2 megs, depending upon how high-powered the station is and how close it is. So if you have TV above and below, you've got an automatic 3 meg guard band built into the WMTS channel. And obviously that causes concerns with the ability for WMTS to fully enjoy the use of the channel. However, the good news out of that is that while the TV TV stations aren't terribly active in terms of moving around a lot in spectrum, they can work around that. With repacking, that could be problematic. It could be problematic from the standpoint of you could have more TV adjacent channel and more TV above and below. So that's the TV issue. As Andy said again, the other issue would be CMRS base stations that could be either above and below. They're probably not as bad as television, but that needs to be studied. The concern really there is that there will be maximum number of high-powered base stations that would be operating nearby a hospital, indeed perhaps even on a hospital building. And so we need to have some, means to protect the WMTS. Some of the discussions that were put out there include checking the database to see what hospitals are there, or like what the TV stations do when they operate. They contact the hospital, and there's a relationship that's established between the TV station and the hospital. Then there's the operation inside the band. Oh, and then there's the white space operations there. And there is an emission mask that everybody seemed to agree on when it was filed. And so the emission mask will help protect out-of-band emissions into Channel 37 fairly well. And then there's the operation of unlicensed devices within Channel 37. And across the board, for this 18 megs that is adjacent and within Channel 37, the issue is really patient safety. And as I described earlier, the chance for interference into WMTS it goes up with more adjacent channel type operation, or some of the operations that have been discussed. And so the hospital community, the WMTS community, is concerned about the potential for increased interference, and which could manifest as issues with patient safety. Especially the use case that I described earlier, where you might have a patient presenting in the ER, where everybody has watched ER or any sort of healthcare show knows that it's like that and worse, especially if you've been to an ER, which I know I have many times. Which is not a context on how I live my life, but it's just
doing technical work.
Yeah, The trouble is, you get to have problems. Anyhow, enough said. Anyhow, you show up at the ER, you have some sort of a trauma, you get fitted with WMTS, and you're there. And the reason they outfit them with WMTS is they'll move this patient throughout the hospital to a trauma center nearby, or even to an ER nearby. And they need to keep that link. And so if that link is interfered with, the hospital then has to go through a lot of means to troubleshoot and find out what it is. And if that link is subject to interference, then the hospital is concerned about the reliability of that, and that calls into context other issues. And so, I would bring everybody back to the record. The record on the WMTS proceeding, on the white space proceeding, was fairly solid insofar as all the commenters on that record that answered the question about operation in WMTS agreed that issue of patient safety was important and that we didn't need to operate in that band. And so that hasn't changed. It's important to protect patient safety, and those are the issues that we face, with WMTS and all these other operations.
Alan?
Sure.
So just answer all these questions.
Yeah. No, I know. Well, I do want to talk about all three. Let's look at the coexistence of low-power TV white space devices, so 100 milliwatt, 40 milliwatt. So, think Wi-Fi again, with channel 37, with wireless mics, and with the LTE downlink, which is really the discussion on the guard band. I think in the case of the first two, the first thing I'd start with, if the charter is let's make more efficient use of the spectrum, and 99% of the spectrum is not being used, let's find a way to share. We've solved harder problems than this. We can make it work. And in the case of wireless medical telemetry and radio astronomy, those are fixed locations. You can carve them out in the database, provide enough buffer, make sure that the devices can operate in those locations, test it, validate it, and then that would be my argument for how to proceed there. In the case of the wireless mics, we agree 100%. All the services that Robert talked about are critical. They should work, and we could find a way to make them work. Reserving two channels and setting that aside so it's easier for lots of places to know that they have services makes sense. We support that 100%. In the case of the news crews, we believe that we can really shorten the time interval so that any one of those crews, wherever they are, they can have that access to those channels and share them for the other 99% of the time or locations that the spectrum's not being used. It does take more work than any of the organizations have put in now, and I'd argue that the reason is there's not a will right now for that to happen, and I'd ask the FCC to say make it happen, then challenge the organizations to work together to do that, and meet the standard that a news crew can go deliver service. Finally, with the the coexistence of how big does the guard band need to be? Our argument is that with 12 megahertz of spectrum, we believe that you can use 6 megahertz for unlicensed operation, the 6 megahertz that's closest to TV and farthest away from the operating handset. And basically, if you use the precedent that you already set in the H block in terms of the protection afforded to LTE, the unlicensed folks will find a way to make that work and not interfere with LTE. So maybe that gives you, Tom, some input on what the parameters that we expect LTE, the standard that could operate at. And if that's done, there may also be possibility to operate in the duplex gap. I'm not sure. It depends on the rules. Clearly, it'd be better to separate LTE and TV. I think it makes it easier for everybody. And where that's possible, that would be great. Filters, costs go down for everybody.
Bob, you've been patient.
Well, we are at our major production centers in New York. We have 8 sound stages that are operating. In TV City and Hollywood, probably 8 to 10 sound stages. In our studio center, 25 sound stages. In these locations where we can take advantage of building shielding, we are already adjacent channel, co-channel operation. So if we can take advantage of building shielding, we'll do it. However, when we're out on location undercover with 60 Minutes trying to interview a bad guy who we don't know where he's going to be, having a wire coming out of your hand sort of gives it away. So having wireless channels that we can depend upon in locations where we don't know where we're going to be become essential. A lot of times, if we're covering a breaking story such as a tornado, we don't have 15 minutes to wait. Public safety is at paramount importance. The tornado is bearing down on the community. Get out, seek shelter. We can't wait. We're dodging debris. Our reporters are running. They need the wireless microphones to be able to do that. So as a result, waiting an hour might be too late. By that time, the community has been destroyed. So getting the information out not only on broadcast, but cable, satellite, internet, and on mobile devices is essential. So when we provide a public service of notification about public safety, it's not just free over-the-air broadcast, it's to all these other devices, including the internet and mobile. And maybe broadcast LTE is a way to help that process along.
Ryan, did you have anything you want to add?
So TV white space devices actually have one of the toughest set of the rules to abide. From both the out-of-band mission perspective, also from being able to live and operate in an environment, you have very strong interference from broadcast signals. And then there's a lot of intelligence built into the device to be able to handle these, interferences. I think wireless microphone and other, devices can take advantage of what actually, the new technology that used by TV white space to, overcome some of the problem that, some of the folks here mentioned. And regarding to the, live event coverage, I think, first of all, the channels, you set aside 2 channels. These 2 channels are variable channels in the first place, right? So you don't have a dedicated 2 channel you can go to. That's fine. So, there's some level of intelligence has to build into the radio to be able to adapt. So, adding, reserve 2 channel with not knowing where these 2 channels are doesn't really help much. And also, on top of that, I think wireless microphone today can use, in the case of emergency, it can really use some of the, broadcast channels where the signal is weak. And they're using that today anyway, right? As Michael said. So.
I'd just like I had a hunch there'd be responses.
And I just wanted to respond to your question about the 2 channels being variable by market, and therefore you don't really know where they are. The professional wireless microphone equipment that's out there today has a wide tuning range, and this has been increasing over time, actually, to take more advantage of UHF spectrum. Interestingly, while it becomes a smaller footprint overall, but tuning to a vacant channel based on whether you're in Dallas or Detroit is a very simple exercise, and any audio professional working in news gathering would obviously know where they needed to tune. But I wanted to respond a little bit to Alan's comment about can't we figure this out? And I think a lot of the suggestions that are being made here are talking about increased capacity or capability of this geolocation database, right? And measuring signal strength where your location is, freeing up more channels when things aren't used. This will require the database to be a very robust system. And I think now for most audio professionals, the database is an untested system, right? And I think the Commission was very balanced in the way it set up its initial white space rules to bring these new uses online while not disrupting operations and services, while we began to use this geolocation database for these large event productions. And in the future, if greater capabilities can come from that geolocation database and enable some of this sharing, that's fine. But right now, this is a relatively untested system. And Julie and Ira, as you know, a lot of pro audio users can't access this database in real time and have their data flow through. So how do we expand that group of professional users, aside from broadcasters and motion picture makers who now have the instant access to the database system? How can we expand that population to all these other professional uses and make it more part of the workflow and the daily life for the pro audio community?
Go ahead.
I wanted to address a point that Alan raised. And ComSearch is a white space database administrator, and we work closely with Google and the other 9 of them to make this come about. So we believe in white space. But I want to go back and put my ASHI hat on, which is why I'm here, and that's to address the patient safety issue. There are a series of edge cases that could happen with the database. That is where hospital risk managers live. And if you go back and look at what's happened, for example, in the 5.8 gig unibands or 5 gig, where we had to, there's DFS was enabled and disenabled, which caused the issues with terminal Doppler weather radar. Those are the types of edge cases of which there may be only a few, but like I said, that's what gives risk managers and others at hospitals the nightmares about issues with patient safety. And Alan's got a good point. Perhaps we can work together and try to do some testing or solve this, but those are the people we need to convince really of the ability to share spectrum in that regard, because those are the ones that are going to be making the determinations on whether this is going to work properly or not. So while we know where all the hospitals are, of which there are about 5,800 in the country, if you enjoin all those from operation, think about what that might do to a downtown area where Michael said earlier that's where you might want some white space availability. So I go back to what I said, and that's the hat I'm wearing today is patient safety. And so, like I said, if you've got these edge cases that could cause impact to patient safety, we need to really think about that and address that straight up.
Try to get to a couple of these questions that we had that came in, and maybe just reframe it in a little bit different way. So when we talk about guard bands and so forth and amounts of spectrum, when you start diving down into different levels, it's not just the amount of megahertz. Then I take a 2 and a 3 and a 5 and I add them all up and say you got 20. Because in the end, it matters how these things are put together. And in the earlier panel, we heard a bit about channel bonding. So is there some minimum size here? Obviously, you'd like to have as contiguous blocks. Most of the technology has gone to multiples of 5, I think, across the board. But when we start getting less, is it like when you have a guard band, let's say we wind up at some place, and please don't take away that this is what we're going to do. But suppose we wind up on some of these with a guard band that's 3 megahertz. Does that wind up being tossed away because the technology, any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult to make agile filtering that is going to give you good attenuation in 3 megahertz space. We're looking at more, larger numbers, let me say, and we'll come out maybe with something a little bit more specific. But, think closer to 10 than 3, really. When you're talking about trying to protect a delicate receiver from a high power service, you can't juxtapose them.
Yeah. But just to be clear, I'm not necessarily talking the wireless mobile service and the TV. It could be, we've got 37 here, and trying to figure
absolutely.
out how to do.
Yeah, and I said delicate, and I think the minus 172 dBm criteria from recommendation 769 is sensitive, it's delicate. So really, we're looking at WMTS and RA and as well as DTV and receivers and the LTE base station receiver for the uplink. It has some sensitivity, and trying to figure out where all of these pieces can fit together. And going back to your question, 3 megahertz as a throw it on the wall, see if it sticks, probably isn't going to stick very well.
Anybody else?
Yeah,
Alan?
Feedback on that. So if you look at the guard band in terms of protecting LTE downlink from, say, low power unlicensed operation, if it's 12 megahertz, we're pretty confident that you can squeeze a 6 megahertz channel in there, where it's max separation. If you move it down to 10, maybe not, we'll see. If you get down to 8, for example, then what might happen is you've saved 2 megahertz and you've thrown away 6 usable in terms of benefit. So you've kind of crossed the threshold at that point. We're happy to provide more analysis on that, but that would be an example where 2 megahertz actually cost you 6.
Yeah, it's something that we're thinking about as well, and probably need a little more dialogue on, because when you move around the pieces on the chart, at the
Right.
end of the day, and you have a band plan, and you want to be sure that when you think you have 6 or you think you have 8 that's usable, that that's really what it is,
Right.
or close to it.
Yeah, let me make one comment. I think we put on the record 3 meg guard band, would be probably appropriate for protecting WMTS. It's that, that 1.5 meg. Specifically, though, if the mask is still used, and obviously we're not going to have television in that 3 meg. We're probably not television, and so we're not really worried about high-powered neighbors. The one point I did want to make, and we didn't address it, and we can come down the line a little later, is TDD operation, because TDD operation in the hospital would be really bad. And so, if we want to go back and forth on that, but Tom wants to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the fact that if we talk about these guard bands, the technically reasonable requirement that we have here is protection of licensed services. And adding in the unlicensed, while certainly important, is not something that should be overriding the licensed paired spectrum that you get out of this, because at the end of the day, the spectrum we're trying to get here is occupied by the broadcasters, and the way to get them cleared out is to get money from the forward auction, which is from the licensed piece of this. So I just want to highlight the fact that we still need as much licensed paired spectrum out of this process in order to clear any of the spectrum at all.
Julie, I'd also note just a quick thing on this point, which I have to start with the caveat that I'm not an engineer, right? So, but I just want to make sure this is on
That's
the
okay.
table.
I'm not a lawyer.
But is the in thinking about these the guard bands in particular, like for example, what Alan was saying about you may need a 12 megahertz so that the middle 6 is fully usable for unlicensed and so on. I think it's important for the Commission to think in terms of the concept of protection zones rather than exclusion zones, and that would be true on at the edge of Channel 37 as well. This is something that actually Mark Gibson and Dennis Roberson, the chair of the FCC's TAC, and a couple others came up with in the CSMAC with respect to sharing the 1755 band, and that is that you don't want to just have a hard and fast exclusion zone necessarily, because it could be that if you power down as you go towards the border, that you can use more megahertz. So if you don't need to be operating, if you can operate at 100 milliwatts close to the border, you might be able to have a wider channel than if you were operating at 1 watt. So I think that's important too, that these be variable zones and not just hard and fast exclusion zones.
So I think from a technology perspective, we can take advantage, smaller spectrum chunks, as Julie, as you mentioned. But what Alan said is very important. How much overhead it takes. If the overhead becomes a big part of the the band you're using, then you're wasting. You pretty much don't use much of the resource at all.
So let me read one of the questions. I'll just read it verbatim. In the context of minimizing interference to incumbents, can any of the panelists provide some further background around the tethering of low-power consumer-oriented TV whitespace devices, also known as 802.11af, personal portables, to help people understand what the future of the TV whitespace ecosystem will look like? Brief example would be appreciated. Any thoughts? Alan, you mentioned AF.
AF is in the works. It's going to be published soon. I know that there are some manufacturers Wi-Fi manufacturers who are working now on prototypes, and so you'll see equipment out at some point. And if you imagine how this might play out, is that if it's integrated in the existing Wi-Fi, it's an inexpensive way to extend this functionality into many consumer devices which already have Wi-Fi. And think of it as another gear in your communications engine, where you now have this low power, longer range option that you can use in certain locations. And then the utility is, as we mentioned before, it's pretty broad. Julie, there was one other point I wanted to raise on the previous issue.
Yep.
With coexistence and last mile access. We did a trial in Cape Town, South Africa, and instead of using F-curves, we used Longley Rice to model the propagation of television. And we operated high power, so 4-watt ERRP, on adjacent channels to television. And we have gathered data over 6 months, and there's been no reported TV interference of TV reception. and there was no issue with the broadcast. And so I would just say there are opportunities down the road as you get more confident in the rules and in the operation of this to further optimize the system.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do it publicly there. Is that an ATSC or is that a DVB-H system in that area?
So there were actually two. One was PAL, and the other was there's also DTV. Okay. So both. So we had to deal with both analog and digital. Okay.
I've got one more question. I think the easiest thing is just read it. It says, I operate a WISP on unlicensed spectrum. One of the problems I encounter regularly is that a consumer device operating indoors near an access point on the same channel can severely limit its ability to reach distant broadband users who are in great need of service. This problem would be more severe on the lower frequencies in the TV bands because they can more easily propagate outward through the walls and buildings. Can we make rules for unlicensed white devices that ensure that consumer devices operate on different channels from fixed wireless broadband services and do not create this harmful interference? Thoughts, reactions? Huh?
That's your question.
That's my question. Mike, what do you think?
One of the comments that I've seen on some of the interference issues that we've been talking about is for the unlicensed devices, regrettably, some of these interference environments are going to be harsh. They don't get primary service protection. And when you're talking about a WISP type of device operating on an unlicensed band, they are unfortunately stepping into that zone. So I think it's difficult to start off by saying, as the questioner asks, yeah, here's how we're going to protect them. However, one of the things that probably should be done is, again, give careful consideration to the out-of-band characteristics and the power levels. Certainly that's ongoing for all of these devices, and take the opportunity to make sure that as we translate rules from 700 megahertz or other regions into this band, that we're making the appropriate translation of the limits. I think one of our other panelists made that comment as well.
On kind of in that vein, and maybe looking at a slightly different perspective on how this may play out as we go down and conduct these auctions. But obviously there'll be a lag time from now till the commission gets rules out, till we conduct an auction, till systems are actually built. So any thoughts on what types of devices can operate, say, in areas that maybe we auction off in the interim till new systems come online, and kind of along with that, any thoughts to in the coexistence area with that, and as you transition from those areas to the commission contemplating maybe some kind of maybe conservative type protection criteria at the beginning, but as we go down forward in time, obviously technology gets better, filter technology gets better. Do you see where that might be going, and the ability that we can modify the rules on kind of a sliding scale over time as those technologies progress?
One thing I'd like to react to is the last part of your question, which was on the filter technologies. And again, CEA is recommending that we try to avoid forecasting how filter technologies are going to progress. Part of the problem, aside from the obvious point there that I made earlier, is that with the market variability, you're not going to have sharp cutoffs at band edges, and so people will be trying to switch in filter banks, and those filter banks will necessarily be a little wider than a single channel. You can't make a device cost effectively that's going to have sharp, hard filtering on a per channel basis as we do with band filtering. So that is a little bit of a challenge, to be flexible in the interim with uncertain. I'm not trying to cast this in a negative light. It's simply the way that the environment is going, is we don't know exactly where the device is going to be operating in a lot of cases.
I can address the first part of your question at least, which is that we've already proposed that the Commission simply maintain the status quo in the 600 megahertz band. In other words, that is, if spectrum is in any discrete local area is vacant, and it can be used on an unlicensed basis without interfering with the licensee, just as the way it is with TV stations, then you should allow it. So we can just maintain the status quo, I think, and allow this white space after the auction to be used by unlicensed devices, subject to the automated enforcement mechanism of the TV bands database, so that licensees, when they've deployed and are ready to commence service, they simply notify a TV bands database that, okay, we're going to start serving now this local area, and so that channel or that frequency band, it won't be a channel any longer specifically, but that then comes out, and the device just operates on different channels. So it's really the closest thing to a spectrum efficiency free lunch you can imagine, because there's absolutely no downside or risk to the licensees, because the only thing they would possibly have to do is let the TV bands database know that they're about to commence service, in this census tract or in this municipality.
Julie, the pro audio community would definitely echo that, the longest possible transition time, and I think you folks are painfully aware of why. All of the 700 megahertz equipment that was retired just 2 years ago was largely replaced by 600 megahertz band equipment. So I would agree with Michael here that the longest possible time that spectrum is still available before the new license services come online should be granted to the current users.
If
the
folks,
shortest possible.
Folks bid for a license, they're going to be using it fairly quickly. So I don't think it'll be a very long transition process. And I also would say it's not going to be commencement of service, it'll be commencement of use, because there's an awful lot of first office where they actually do testing and other things before they actually provide commercial service. So it'll be even before commercial service is up and running.
And the TV bands database is made for that. You just make a reservation.
So we probably could go on a while more, but people are getting hungry, and I heard a report about when people get hungry, they get grouchy. So just a quick observation. I think the challenge for all of us is not whether we have wireless microphones or unlicensed or medical telemetry or radio astronomy. It's trying to figure out how we make the most efficient use and accommodate all these different desires to use the spectrum and all the good that comes with it. Encouraged, I think, hearing there's still plenty of room, I think, for head scratching on how we figure all of this out. And mindful too of the very real engineering challenges that we have, and sometimes as we're continuing the spectrum world to press the envelope on access methods and how we can do more than we did before and still have the confidence that things are going to work the way they're intended is really the challenge for all of us. So I want to thank the panel. I thought it was a terrific discussion for all of you, and I thought we had a great session today. So please, round of applause for everybody.